If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 131, Clowns and Breeches. In the vast expanse of Sweet Liberty's docking bay, reality itself seemed to hold its breath. The sleek Eldar vessel, all graceful curves and wraithbone elegance, settled into one of the 200 docking ports like a predatory bird coming to rest. The atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation, charged with both physical and metaphysical energy that made the very air crackle with potential. Franklin Valorian stood before the airlock, his massive frame a monument to transhuman engineering, yet somehow dwarfed by the presence that surrounded him, the ghostly manifestation of Cain himself, a shimmer of violence barely contained within reality's bounds. Around him, his prime-born captains formed a crescent of power that would have given pause to lesser beings. When the Witessayers emerged, they did so with calculated grandeur. Their alabaster wraithbone armor seemed to pulse with power, capes floating on currents of psychic energy that normal reality never knew. Their blank masks, devoid of features save for elaborate runes that shifted and changed with each passing moment, concealed faces that had witnessed every horror imaginable. Each step they took released waves of psychic pressure that would have driven mortal minds to madness. It was, by any measure, an impressive display of power. Yet the response they received was far from what they expected. Denzel Washington, first captain of the Liberty Eagles, regarded them with the same unimpressed calm he had shown while cutting through armies of demons. His hands remained relaxed, nowhere near the hilts of his legendary blades, Kusanagi no Tsurugi and Totsuka no Tsurugi. The message was clear, their display warranted neither defense nor aggression. Stephen Armstrong's response was even more dismissive. He took a long draw from his cigar. The smoke he exhaled formed perfect rings that drifted through the Whitey's psychic aura, a casual violation of their attempted dominance display that spoke volumes. John Ezra, the director of the Secret Service, maintained his position with the stillness of a statue. He was recording every detail of the Xenos visitors while betraying nothing of his own capabilities. His silence carried its own weight, the quiet confidence of one who had seen far worse and lived to classify it. Vladimir, chief librarian of the Liberty Eagles, demonstrated perhaps the most pointed dismissal. Without breaking eye contact with the Witessayers, he raised a flask of Libertin vodka to his lips and took a long drink. His psychic defenses weren't just holding against their pressure, they were actively ignoring it, like a mountain ignoring a breeze. Henry Cavill, the man out of time, observed with the detached interest of one who had seen it all. His stance conveyed a few words: classic Eldar. Director Jackson's scoff echoed in the cavernous space. "Damn knife ears always gotta make an entrance," he muttered, loud enough to carry. He analyzed their every movement, already feeding data to the CIA's vast intelligence networks. In the background, a technozer calmly erected a protective barrier around the mortal crew members, not out of necessity, but protocol. The casual ease with which he maintained the shield while continuing his routine duties spoke volumes about the Liberty Eagles' technological sophistication. The Whitey's moment of superiority shattered when they felt it, a gaze that bypassed flesh, bone, and soul to pierce the very essence of their being. Franklin's eyes met theirs, and behind him, through him, with him, burned the regard of Kala Mencha Cain himself. The power of the war god's attention fell upon them like the weight of dying suns, an oppressive force that threatened to unmake reality itself. In that moment, the Witessayers understood with crystal clarity that they stood before more than a mere Mundaki Primarch. They faced the chosen hand of Cain, a being who had earned the respect and allegiance of an Eldar god through deeds that would become legends. The psychic pressure they had attempted to exert seemed suddenly childish, like bringing a candle to challenge a supernova. Their salute came swiftly, born of both respect and survival instinct. "Praise Kala Mencha Cain," they intoned, their voices carrying the harmonic resonance of their race. "Hail the hand of the war god! Honor be to Segurika's chosen!" The words echoed in the vast chamber, and with them came a subtle shift in the Whitey's bearing. Their initial dismissal of aiding a Mundaki in their sacred duties dissolved in the face of undeniable truth. This was no mere transhuman warrior, this was a being who had earned his place in the cosmic order through deeds of beating the great enemy again and again. Franklin's response was characteristically balanced between formal and informal. His hand extended in greeting, a curiously human gesture that nonetheless carried the weight of galaxies behind it. When one of the Witessayers took it, the contact was brief but significant, a bridge between ancient power and new legend. "Let us begin," Franklin said, his smirk carrying echoes of battles yet to come and victories yet to be won. The words were simple, but they reverberated with purpose. Around him, his prime-born captains shifted almost imperceptibly, each ready to execute their part in the grand strategy that would unfold. They had faced down demons and Xenos, beat all chaos had to offer, and raised the dark city of Kymarak. This new challenge was simply another chapter in their continuing legend. The Witessayers, their lesson in humility complete, fell into step beside Franklin as they moved deeper into Sweet Liberty's labyrinthine corridors. They had come expecting to guide a Monday key through tasks beyond his comprehension. They left that expectation behind in the docking bay, along with any doubt about why Segurac himself had chosen this particular warrior for this crucial task. The planning chamber of Sweet Liberty stood as a testament to humanity's mastery of both technology and space. Its vast expanse housed countless data screens and auger arrays, but at its heart beat something far more profound, a hololith projection that turned simple light into a map of reality's skeleton. Here, in this chamber where science met sorcery, Franklin stood before the gathered wisdom of millennia. When the Witessayers approached the hololith, reality seemed to hold its breath. Their alabaster armor whispered secrets across the deck plates as they raised their hands in synchronized motion. The map, already a marvel of cosmic cartography, suddenly exploded into complexity. What had been a labyrinth became an infinity, paths splitting into paths, each one glowing with possibilities that stretched beyond mortal comprehension. Franklin's eyebrows rose, his transhuman mind processing the astronomical increase in data. "Well," he said, his voice carrying the weight of newfound respect, "that's a hell of a lot more than we thought." "This," one Witessayer spoke, voice carrying harmonics that echoed in dimensions beyond normal space, "is but one variation among infinite possibilities. We chose this particular stratum because it bears the wounds we must heal." The map shifted again, focusing now on the true nature of their battlefield. The webway revealed itself in all its impossible glory, not truly a dimension, but something far more subtle and dangerous. A lacework of reality threaded between the material universe and the howling chaos of the warp, each tunnel glowing with the light of ancient technologies and powers long forgotten. The ancient ones, the second Witessayer continued, built more than mere tunnels. They created a tapestry that binds reality itself together. Neither fully real nor wholly immaterial, the webway exists in the spaces between spaces. Franklin studied the display intently, his hand passing through one of the projected pathways. Like capillaries between muscle fibers, he mused. Carrying the lifeblood of reality itself. An apt metaphor, the first Witessayer acknowledged. The projection zoomed in on 4 locations, each one marked by swirling distortions that spoke of reality's wounds. "These are your targets, Hand of Cain." Each breach is held open not by mere chance, but by the will and anchor of a greater daemon. "The ruinous powers," Franklin nodded, his expression hardening. "They're keeping their foot in the door. And Segurac can't handle this himself because to do so would draw the direct attention of the dark gods," the first Witessayer explained. "Where now they send their servants, they would come themselves. The laughing god is powerful, but even he must choose his battles carefully in these dark times." Franklin nodded slowly, his tactical mind already processing the implications. "So you need someone with enough power to kill greater demons, but not enough significance to attract the direct attention of the chaos gods themselves." A grim smile crossed his features. "Someone expendable. Someone who has proven capable," the second Witessayer corrected. "The Hand of Cain is far from expendable, but you operate outside the traditional powers they monitor most closely." Speaking of monitoring, Franklin gestured to the wider webway map, "We're likely to have company. The Dark Eldar aren't known for missing opportunities." A sound emerged from behind the Whitey's ears, masks that might have been laughter, had it not carried centuries of bitter knowledge. "Ah yes. The notorious one who burned Kymarak. Our dark kin remember you well, Primarch." "Our dark kin are problematic," the second Witessayer stated. "But they are a minor concern compared to the task at hand. Should they interfere, we will assist in their elimination. It is the least we can do." Franklin turned back to the map, studying the breach points. "The permanent sealing, how does that work? What's to stop them from just tearing new holes?" The first Witessayer stepped forward, manipulating the display to show the psychic architecture of the webway itself. "Once sealed properly, these breaches can only be reopened by beings of immense power. The architect of fate possesses such strength, but it drowns in its own schemes, too caught in webs of possibility to focus its full attention here. And should it try?" The other 3 would object strongly, Franklin nodded. "The great game never ends." "Precisely. Though you yourself possess tools that could assist in more than mere sealing," the Witessayer pointed out Franklin's trophy from Comaruk, the reality engine that was currently in the impossible city, Kalastar. Why the laughing god wishes you to have this formidable artifact? Well, the gods play their own games, do they not? Just as mysterious as Cain's choice of champion. Franklin felt the war god's presence stir within him, a burning reminder of powers he wields. The gods may play their games, he said, his voice carrying echoes of ancient battlefields, but we're the ones who have to clean up the board. The hololith shifted once more, highlighting the paths they would need to take. Each breach pulsed with malevolent energy, a reminder of the powers they would face. But as Franklin studied the display, his mind was already crafting strategies, weighing options, preparing for the battles to come. In the end, it wasn't just about earning access to the Black Library. It wasn't even about helping Magnus, though that remained his primary motivation. This was about something larger, about maintaining the delicate balance that kept reality itself from unraveling. The gods might play their eternal games, but sometimes it took a more direct approach to keep the board from shattering entirely. Well then, Franklin said, straightening to his full height, the weight of Cain's presence burning like a star around him, shall we go disappoint some demons? The Witessayer bowed slightly, acknowledging both the Primarch and the god he carried within him. The great work awaited, and reality's wounds wouldn't heal themselves. It was time to remind the dark gods why even they sometimes feared the actions of younger powers. The webway corridor stretched before them like an impossible cathedral of light and shadow, its crystalline walls containing energies that defied mortal comprehension. Within this sacred space, a profane sight greeted them, legions of charismatic demons engaged in eternal combat, their brass-armored forms creating a sea of violence that stretched to the horizon of reality itself. Franklin Valorian stood at Sweet Liberty's command pulpit, his massive frame silhouetted against the cosmic display. In the distance, a chaos altar pulsed with malevolent energy, its protective shields writhing with unnatural colors that hurt the mind to observe. Sweet Liberty, Franklin began, his voice carrying the casual confidence of one accustomed to wielding planet-destroying firepower, target that altar. Primarch, wait. The urgency in the Whitey's ear's normally melodious voice cut through the command like a blade. You cannot. Franklin turned, one eyebrow raised. Problem. The Whitey's ear's blank mask somehow managed to convey exasperation. Your vessel, its weapons would do more than destroy the altar. You risk expanding the breach itself. The Necrons learned this lesson during the War in Heaven, the second Witessayer added, gestures sharp with concern. Each breach they created required centuries of restoration by our ancestors. Franklin's expression shifted to one of tactical adjustment. Energy weapons then? We have quite a selection. The first Whitey's ear's shoulders slumped slightly, a gesture that spoke volumes from a being typically so controlled. Primarch, perhaps we were not clear. Your vessel is the size of a craft world. Any weapon it possesses would be excessive. There was a moment of silence as the Witessayers truly processed what that meant, that they stood aboard a human-made vessel that rivaled the greatest works of their civilization. Their perfectly maintained composure cracked just slightly, revealing a glimpse of awe they quickly suppressed. Now we understand, the second Witessayer murmured, why Cain chose you. The capacity for destruction you command. A slow smile spread across Franklin's face, the kind of smile that had preceded the burning of Comaruk. Well then, if Sweet Liberty's too much gun for the job. He activated the fleet-wide vox. All escorts, do you see the problem in front of us? One by one, 1,000 voices responded, captains of vessels ranging from mighty carriers to swift corvettes, each one a master of void warfare in their own right. Their confirmations echoed through the command chamber like a gathering storm. Franklin's smile widened. I don't want to. The Witessayers barely had time to process his words before reality ignited. 1,000 ships, each one a masterpiece of human engineering, opened fire as one. The relatively small weapons of the escort fleet turned the webway corridor into a canvas of destruction. Disintegration batteries carved lines of light through demonic flesh. Macro cannons thundered their disdain for warp-spawned entities, smart missiles began their flight paths to fireworks, plasma projectors added their song to the symphony of annihilation. The Kyrnate horde, caught in their endless battle fury, had just enough time to realize that their eternal combat was about to be interrupted by something far more final. The foremost ranks simply ceased to exist, their brass armor and corrupted flesh reduced to component atoms by the precision barrage. Behind them, rank after rank of demons discovered that their immunity to projectiles had limits when faced with the concentrated firepower of humanity's most advanced fleet. The Witessayers watched in stunned silence as Franklin orchestrated the destruction with the casual ease of a maestro conducting a familiar symphony. Their masks couldn't hide their mixture of horror and admiration as they witnessed firsthand why the Dark Eldar still had nightmares about this particular Monday key. "You see," Franklin said conversationally, as streams of firepower continued to reorganize reality before them, "sometimes the best solution isn't the biggest gun you have. Sometimes it's just having enough smaller guns firing at the same time." "Your restraint is noted, Primarch," one Witessayer managed, their voice carrying a hint of what might have been humor. "I do try," Franklin replied, watching as the last waves of fire cleared their path to the altar. "Now then, shall we go close that breach? I believe we have some house calls to make." The Witessayers nodded, still processing the casual display of overwhelming firepower they had just witnessed. Perhaps, they reflected, the Laughing God's choice of ally wasn't so mysterious after all. Sometimes the best solution to a cosmic problem was someone who could approach it with both the power of a god and the practical mindset of a soldier who knew exactly how many guns it took to solve a problem. The path to the altar lay clear before them, marked by the cooling remains of what had been a legion of demons. It was time for the next phase of their operation, and if the Witessayers had learned anything in the last few minutes, it was that their allies' definition of subtle would take some getting used to. Through the smoldering ruins of what had once been a temple to endless slaughter, Franklin strode like a tourist. The ground beneath his feet was still cooling from the orbital barrage, glass crunching with each step where daemon blood had been flash-heated to crystalline form. Around him, the very walls of the webway hummed with violated potential, reality itself struggling to heal from the wounds carved into it by chaos. Before them stood a being that embodied millennia of violence. Kograth the Unavenged, bloodthirster of the Eighth Host, towered even over Franklin's transhuman frame. Its brass armor still glowed with residual heat from the bombardment, wings spread wide enough to cast shadows across entire formations. The Daemon's Axe, a weapon that had harvested souls across 1,000 worlds, dripped with the essence of reality itself. Franklin's approach was almost casual, Anaris held with deceptive looseness at his side. "You're one tough bitch," he observed, his voice carrying across the dimensional space between them. "Most things don't stay standing after that kind of welcome party." The bloodthirster's response was a roar that contained the screams of civilizations it had destroyed, a sound that should have shattered sanity and burned reason to ash. "I am Kograth the Unavenged. Eighth of the Blood Host. Harvester of..." Its litany of titles ended in a wet gurgle as Franklin crossed the space between them with transhuman speed. Anaris, the blade that contained Cain's power to end immortality itself, swept through daemon flesh with terrible purpose. The bloodthirster's right arm, still raising its hell-forged axe, separated from its body in a spray of warp essence. Kograth stumbled back, more confused than pained. Pain was an old friend to servants of Kern. Pain was practically currency in the blood god's realm. But this was different. The daemon's eyes widened as it reached out with its consciousness, searching for its severed limb in the warp. There was nothing there. No. The word escaped in a roar of denial that shook reality itself. "It cannot be." Franklin's chuckle carried the weight of Cain's own amusement. "What's wrong, big guy?" He twirled Anaris in a lazy arc, warp light catching on its impossible edge. "Suddenly realizing you can die." Real fear, an emotion foreign to most bloodthirsters, bloomed in Kograth's burning eyes. This was wrong. This violated the natural order of things. Demons were immortal. They could be banished, yes, forced back into the warp to reform, but true death? That was for lesser beings, for mortals, for... The thought ended as Franklin moved again, this time unleashing Anaris in a strike that contained not just physical force but the conceptual weight of Cain's own power. The blade met Kograth's hell-forged axe, and for a brief moment, the two weapons sang against each other, a duet of destruction that echoed through dimensions. Then Anaris, carrying the weight of a god's decree, sheared through both weapon and wielder. Kograth the Unavenged, bloodthirster of the Eighth Host, experienced something no daemon of its stature had known before, the absolute certainty of ending. As its form separated along the line of Franklin's cut, it felt not just its physical form dying, but its very essence unraveling. There would be no return to the blood god's halls. No reformation in the warp. No chance for revenge or redemption. Just, nothing. The daemon's final scream contained something beyond rage or pain, the existential horror of an immortal being discovering its mortality. It echoed through the webway's corridors, a sound that would haunt the dreams of those who heard it, carrying as it did the death of something that should not have been able to die. As the last traces of Cograth faded from existence, not just banished but truly ended, Franklin turned to the Witessayers. Their blank masks couldn't hide their awe at what they had witnessed. Cain's presence burned around him like a corona of divine violence, acknowledging the first use of Anaris's restored power. "Well," Franklin said, cleaning the blade with a casual flick, "I'd say the sword works as advertised, ever since merging with Cain's war's hard. Shall we move on to the next breach? I believe we have 3 more appointments to keep." Behind him, where Cograth had stood, there was nothing, not even the usual residue of warp energy that lingered after a daemon's banishment. The bloodthirster was simply gone, ended in a way that would send ripples through the warp itself. The message to the ruinous powers was clear: their servants were no longer guaranteed immortality. Attack the Liberator at your own peril. The aftermath of divine violence still lingered in the air, reality itself trembling in the wake of a greater daemon's true death. Franklin stood, Anaris, still humming with the power of permanent ending, rested in his grip as he turned to leave. Then he remembered. Wait, Franklin's voice carried the weight of command that could stop armies in their tracks. What about the breach? Shouldn't we? His words died in his throat. There, in the space where reality had been torn asunder by chaos, stood a figure that defied the grimdark aesthetic of the universe itself. A being that looked as if it had stepped out of a children's picture book rather than the annals of cosmic war. The clown, for there was no other word that could adequately describe this entity, wore a motley of colors so bright they seemed to offend physics itself. In its hands, held with all the serious dedication of a grandmother preparing to darn socks, were an oversized needle and thread. The needle gleamed with impossible light, its eye large enough to pass a human hand through. The thread, if it could be called that, seemed to be woven from starlight and laughter. Franklin, veteran of 1,000 battles, bearer of a god's power, and witness to events that had shaped the fate of galaxies, could only manage one response. What the fuck? The clown, its face painted in patterns that seemed to rearrange themselves when viewed directly, gave Franklin what could only be described as a vaudevillian wink. Then, with movements that belonged more in a circus than in the space between dimensions, it began to sew. The needle danced through the fabric of the webway itself, weaving space and time back together with stitches that somehow managed to be both precise and utterly ridiculous. Each pass of the needle was accompanied by a sound that should not have existed, something between a giggle and the birth of a star. The Witessayers, beings of ancient power and dignity, stood in perfect stillness. Their blank masks betrayed nothing, but their rigid postures suggested they were trying very, very hard to maintain their composure out of fear or out of laughter only they know. Franklin watched as the cosmic tailor continued its work, each stitch sealing the breach with a level of effectiveness that bordered on the absurd. The clown's movements became increasingly theatrical, a pirouette here, a bow there, each gesture accompanied by sparkles that had no business existing in this or any other dimension. This, Franklin said to no one in particular, is definitely Seguruk. The clown paused in its sewing to give Franklin an elaborate bow, complete with a flourish that sent its motley spinning in impossible directions. Then, with a final thrust of the needle that somehow included a backflip, it tied off the last stitch. The breach, which had moments ago been a wound in reality itself, was now sealed with stitches that looked exactly like the kind one might find on a well-loved stuffed animal. They even seemed to twinkle. As the clown prepared to depart, it turned to Franklin and produced, from seemingly nowhere, a small card. With another elaborate bow, it presented the card to the Primarch. Upon inspection, it appeared to be a job well done. Sticker, complete with a smiling star. Before Franklin could formulate a response appropriate to the situation, if such a response existed, the clown vanished in a puff of glitter that smelled inexplicably of fresh-baked cookies. The sound of otherworldly laughter echoed through the webway, suggesting that Seguruk had found Franklin's reaction entirely worth the effort of this elaborate performance. Right, Franklin managed, still staring at the perfectly sewn breach. I suppose that's one way to do it. As they turned to leave, heading for their next target, Franklin could have sworn he heard the distant sound of a cosmic laugh track. The laughing god, it seemed, had a very particular sense of humor. The Witessayers, maintaining their dignity through what appeared to be sheer force of will, said nothing. Though one of them might have been hiding a smile behind their mask. It was, after all, not every day that one got to see a Primarch rendered speechless by cosmic needlework. As they made their way back to the fleet, Franklin shook his head. Pops is never going to believe this part, he muttered. Behind him, the stitches continued to twinkle, a reminder that in a universe of grim darkness and eternal war, sometimes the most effective solutions came with a side of divine slapstick. The laughter of Segeric followed them, a melody that spoke of jokes older than stars and punchlines yet to come. Comment. 23 Comment. Vote. 1 left. Chapter 132, Lessons of Fire and Death. In the crystalline depths of the webway, where reality wore thin as gossamer dreams, the dark Eldar flotilla emerged from the labyrinthine passages like predatory fish sensing blood in the water. Their sleek vessels, adorned with the bones of the fallen and powered by the screams of the dying, cut through the ethereal space with practiced precision. But then they saw it, and terror, that most unfamiliar of sensations, gripped even their black hearts. Varictanara, the Accursed One. The name rippled through the Drukari vox nets like a curse, spoken in the harsh whispers of those who had survived Kamarika's darkest day. The sweet liberty loomed before them, a cathedral of war given form in tyranimite and spite, its massive frame blocking out the ethereal light of the webway itself. 1,000 ships surrounded it like a swarm of angry wasps around their queen, each one bearing enough firepower to lay waste to worlds. The Archon stood upon his command deck, cruel features twisted in an expression of carefully masked fear. His Draken leaned close, voice barely a whisper, the Dark Eagle's vessel. The bounty would mean nothing if we were dead, the Archon cut him off, ancient eyes never leaving the Colossus before them. The sweet Liberty's weapon ports gaped like the mouths of hungry gods, each one promising apocalyptic destruction. The Archon had not survived centuries of Kamarika's politics by being foolish. Signal the retreat. Let the major cabals know. Let them throw their forces against this beast, we shall feast on whatever remains. The dark Eldar ships melted back into the shadows of the webway, leaving only ripples in their wake, like nightmares fading before the dawn. As the dark Eldar fleet melted away into the webway's labyrinthine passages, Franklin Valorian watched from Sweet Liberty's bridge with a mixture of amusement and strategic calculation. The Primarch's massive frame cast a long shadow across the command deck as he turned to address Samuel L. Jackson, his field marshal. "Prepare the troops, Sam," he ordered, his voice carrying the easy authority of one born to command. "The dark Eldar may have fled, but they'll return with friends. I want every approach covered." Around them, the bridge hummed with activity as officers relayed orders and coordinated the fleet's defensive positions. Each Primi-born captain had already moved to their assigned choke points throughout Sweet Liberty's vast structure, veterans of countless battles against the Dark Eldar's infamous boarding tactics. Franklin turned to his third captain, Henry Cavill, who stood analyzing hololithic tactical displays with the focused intensity of a master strategist. "The fleet is yours, Henry," Franklin said, clasping his brother-in-arm's shoulder. "Keep our path home clear." Cavill nodded, understanding all that went unsaid between them. "We'll be here when you return, my lord." With that, Franklin strode from the bridge, his footsteps echoing through corridors vast enough to accommodate his transhuman scale. The Eternity Gate awaited, a marvel of techno-arcane engineering that would deliver him to the battlefield below through a wormhole from a monolith. The scene that greeted him as he materialized on the ground was one of calculated devastation. Liberty Guard formations advanced in perfect coordination, their Phosphex weapons creating rivers of all-consuming fire that burned even in the vacuum of the webway. The air itself seemed to scream as the forbidden weapons did their work, reducing Nurgle's pestilent legions to ash and cinder. The orbital bombardment had done its work well, nearly 3/4 of the Daemon host had been annihilated in that first devastating salvo. But Nurgle's children were nothing if not resilient. Those that remained fought on, their bloated forms healing almost as quickly as they were wounded, spreading their grandfather's gifts with every movement. Franklin's enhanced senses took in the battlefield in microseconds. His eyes locked onto a greater daemon that rose above the carnage like a mountain of rotting flesh and corrupted glory. Without hesitation, he launched himself skyward, his superhuman muscles and armor systems working in perfect harmony to propel him through the artificial atmosphere. An arras blazed to life in his hands, the sword's surface becoming as brilliant as a newborn sun. The blade, once the fifth crone sword, now reforged by Fukin's mastery, sang with the fury of Cain himself. Franklin brought it down in a blazing arc that split reality itself, sending a wave of divine fire directly into the greater daemon's corrupted form. The creature had barely time to register its own destruction before it was unmade, its essence burned away by powers antithetical to its very nature. But Franklin was already moving, an arras trailing coronas of flame as he carved through the demonic host with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a bird of prey. In the impossible geometries of New Hycamarak, where reality bent to the whims of its masters and shadows held more truth than light, Asdrubal Vex sat at the head of a table that should not exist. The irony was not lost on him, democracy among the Dark Eldar, perhaps the greatest jest ever played in this city of eternal torment. The council chamber hung suspended in a void of crystalline darkness, illuminated by the cold fire of dying stars captured and preserved for their light. Firefalls cascaded down impossible angles, their perpetual destruction creating an ambience of elegant devastation that suited the gathering perfectly. Vex's fingers traced patterns on the living metal of his throne, one of 11 arranged around the table of accord, though accord was perhaps the greatest jest of all. Each seat represented power absolute within its own domain, yet here they sat, forced into cooperation by the spectre of a threat that had once reduced their predecessor city to ash and memory. Varric. The Accursed One. The Dark Eagle. Franklin Valorian. The name burned in Vex's mind like acid, but he kept his expression carefully neutral as he observed his fellow Archons. Each was a master of their own realm, each nursing ambitions that would see the others dead, if not for the ancient protocols that made this chamber one of the few truly neutral grounds in their twisted society. Vrask of the flayed skull sat like a coiled serpent, his armor adorned with the flayed faces of his enemies. Next to him, Estrachromis of the Obsidian Rose examined her crystalline blade with affected disinterest, though Vec knew she was cataloguing every minute detail of the gathering. The weapon shops of New Comorak were hers, and that alone made her one of the most dangerous beings at the table. Thindrak's hatred for their craft worldkin practically radiated from his form, while the aged Akaraketha's seemingly frail frame belied a mind that had survived centuries of assassination attempts. The twins, Forlcolinth and Wypolian, sat as far apart as the chamber would allow, their mutual loathing charging the air between them with potential violence. Shael Nar Valshavar Ilithrak. May the Dark Eagle feast on your heart. Forlcolinth's curse cut through the tense atmosphere. Lehate Dranth Comorak. Your cabal will burn like Comorak. Wypolian's response was immediate, the ancient tongue making the threat of burning cabals sound like poetry. Vex smirked at their predictability. The prohibition against violence within the chamber was the only thing preventing fratricide, and even that was a tenuous protection at best. Marquis Vakara's glare could have curdled souls, and probably had, given his reputation. The raid on his Panda Iman subrealm still ranked among Vex's favorite recent victories. The memory of the Marquis's face when his prized soul engines were torn from his grasp was a pleasure worth savoring. And then there was Zeratis, the self-styled master of chaos. Vex's lip curled slightly at the thought. Fucking idiot indeed, though even idiots had their uses, especially when pointed in the right direction. But it was the empty seat that drew Vex's eye most often, the throne reserved for Lady Aurelia Malice of the Poisoned Tongue. Once, he had envisioned her by his side, not as an equal but as a prize. She was a vision of cunning and ambition, her rise from the depths of old Low Comorak mirroring his own ascent. Vecht had admired the sharpness of her Byzantine mind, the lethal wit that could turn rivals into allies and allies into prey. Something about her unsettled him, distracted him in a way no one else ever had. Her striking beauty, those crimson lips that curved into a predator's smile, her ruthless grace, she embodied everything he coveted. And deep within the black recesses of his heart, he had harbored a dangerous desire, to possess her, to make her the crowning jewel of his triumph. But his plans had been derailed by the one thing he had not foreseen, the Accursed One. Franklin Valorian, the Primarch, the flame that consumed old Comorak. It was a mistake of his own making, though none could ever know. Vex's greed, his unquenchable thirst for dominance, had led him to raid a particular trade route, to seize a scientific vessel that carried secrets too tempting to ignore. Secrets that had drawn the wrath of the Accursed One. When Valorian came, it was with the fury of a storm, reducing Comorak to ash and shadow. In the inferno of that assault, not only did the towers of the nobles crumble but also Vex carefully laid plans. His ambition to make Aurelia Malice his consort had been burned away with the city itself. Now, she sat as his rival, a power equal to his own. Lady Malice, whose name was whispered with both reverence and fear, had clawed her way into the ranks of the great cabals. No longer a trophy to adorn his throne, she was now a threat, her ambitions no less vast than his own. Still, in the solitude of his darkest thoughts, Vecht wondered, if he had not raided that trade route, if he had not taken that scientific vessel, would things have been different? Would old Comorak have stood unbroken? Would she have been his? These were questions he would never voice, not even to himself. Yet, as his gaze lingered on the empty seat, a flicker of what might have been gnawed at him, a weakness he would never admit. For Aurelia Malice had risen from the ashes of old Comorak, not as his consort but as his rival. And that, more than any other truth, was a wound he could never entirely forget. The doors to the chamber parted like lips opening for a kiss, and she entered. Vect felt his breath catch, a reaction he immediately despised himself for having. Malice moved like liquid poetry, her armor a second skin that left no doubt about the deadly grace it contained. Her hair cascaded like spilled ink touched by flame, and those red lips held secrets that had driven lesser beings mad with desire. The firefalls seemed to dim in her presence, as if reality itself bent slightly to accommodate her passage. Her fan snapped open with a sound like a blade being drawn. "Am I late?" The question dripped from those perfect lips like honey laced with toxins. Her eyes met his, and the wink that followed was both invitation and warning. "Like what you see, Asdrubal." Vect realized he had been staring and smoothly transformed his momentary lapse into a calculated gesture of appreciation. "You are a vision of lethal grace as always, Lady Malice." The words were precise, measured, a move in their eternal game of strategy and seduction. But beneath the courtesy, his mind raced with calculations. How many assassins had he sent against her? How many had she turned to her own purposes? Each attempt on her life had failed, and each failure had somehow strengthened her position. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a weapon he couldn't wield, and that made her the most dangerous being in the chamber. "To business then," Vect declared, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had made him master of the Blackheart Cabal. "The accursed one walks the webway once more. Sweet liberty and her 1,000 escorts thread our ancient paths like a cancer in the veins of reality itself." The chamber erupted in a cacophony of voices, each archon competing to be heard above the others. Vect let them vent their immediate reactions, watching how each revealed their private fears and ambitions in their response to the news. Vect watched as each archon offered their thoughts, most advocating caution. The memory of old Camaraka's fall was still too fresh, the weight of the Dark Eagle's reputation too heavy. Then Lady Malice began to speak, and Vect watched in admiration as she wove her web of words. Her argument was masterful, playing on each archon's fears and ambitions in equal measure. "The lesser archons grow restless," she purred, her fan dancing like a blade in candlelight. "They whisper of opportunity while we sit in our towers, paralyzed by memory and fear." Vect saw the effect her words had on the others. Even the twins had stopped their bickering to listen. "Imagine," she continued, "if some minor player were to succeed where we feared to try. What then of our positions? What then of the careful balance we've built?" Her eyes met Vec's for a moment, and he saw the dangerous intelligence there. She was right, of course. The political structure of New Camarag was far more fragile than that of its predecessor. One significant shift in power could shatter everything they'd built from the ashes of the old city. "But there's an opportunity here," Lady Malice's voice dropped to an intimate whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the chamber. "The lesser cabals yearn for glory. Let them have it, let them throw themselves against the Dark Eagle's guns. Those who survive will be easier to control, and those who don't will no longer pose a threat." Vect finished the thought, earning a smile that sent shivers down his spine. "And let us not forget the prize," she added, her fan snapping shut with finality. "The sweet liberty, a vessel that could hold New Camarag itself hostage. Imagine such power in the hands of whoever proves worthy." The chamber erupted in calculated murmurs of agreement. Vect watched as Lady Malice's words took root in each archon's mind, transforming their fear into ambition. It was masterfully done. She had given them a way to act without seeming weak, to risk everything while risking nothing of their own. Yet even as he joined in the general consensus, Vec's mind was racing ahead. Lady Malice's plan was perfect, too perfect. What game was she really playing? Did she truly expect them to believe she would be content to let others claim such a prize? No, there was something else at work here. But that was the beauty of it. Even knowing there must be a deeper scheme, none of them could afford not to participate. To stand aside now would be to risk everything. Lady Malice had maneuvered them all into a position where they had to act, had to commit their forces, had to play whatever game she had designed. As the council broke up, each archon already planning their own schemes within schemes, Vect caught Lady Malice's eye one final time. She offered him a smile that promised everything and nothing, then disappeared in a swirl of animated shadows. Vect remained in his throne long after the others had gone, contemplating the web they'd all willingly walked into. The Dark Eagle was returning to the webway, and New Camarag would move against him not because they wanted to, but because Lady Malice had made it impossible for them not to. "Well played," he whispered to the empty chamber. Whether he meant Lady Malice's manipulation or the Dark Eagle's ability to inspire such fear even in absence, even he wasn't quite sure. One thing was certain: the coming conflict would reshape the balance of power in New Camarag, one way or another. The only question was whether any of them would survive to see what rose from the ashes this time. Archon Karith of the Cabal of Shattered Dreams was born into a new Chimerak that remembered the Dark Eagle only through whispered tales and fading scars. Unlike his elders, who still woke in cold sweats remembering the day their ancient city burned, Karith saw those stories as exactly that, stories meant to frighten children and keep ambitious young Archons in line. Standing on the bridge of his flagship, the Crimson Spite, he watched the tactical holograms with barely concealed contempt. The Sweet Liberty's massive form dominated the display, its escort fleet arranged in what he considered an amateur formation, heavily concentrated at bow and stern, leaving the flanks seemingly exposed. "Look at them," he sneered to his bridge crew, his armor's joints crying out in crystalline tones as he gestured at the display. Cowering behind their escorts like frightened groks. "Is this the terrible Dark Eagle that makes our elders tremble?" His lieutenants exchanged glances, their own youth making them eager to believe their leader's bravado. None of them had seen old Chimerak burn. None of them had witnessed entire cabals reduced to atoms in seconds by the Sweet Liberty's weapons. Their knowledge came from books and tales, easily dismissed as exaggeration. "The Imperials always build their ships the same way," Karith continued, pacing the command deck with predatory grace. "Slow, clumsy monsters relying on broadside batteries and forward guns. They leave their flanks exposed because they're too stupid to protect them properly." He paused, a cruel smile playing across his features. "And look how they've arranged their escorts, practically begging us to strike at their flagship's vulnerable sides." The tactical officer, slightly older than most of the bridge crew, cleared his throat. "My lord, the records speak of unusual weapon configurations on the Sweet Liberty. Perhaps we should." "The records speak of many things," Karith cut him off. "They speak of demons in the shadows and monsters under beds. Ideal in reality, not ancient propaganda meant to keep us fearful and compliant." He zoomed in on the massive vessel's hull, highlighting what appeared to be standard Imperial weapon emplacements. "See? Nothing we haven't encountered before. The only difference is the scale, and bigger just means easier to hit." His raiding fleet of 200 ships moved through the webway with practiced precision. Each vessel was a masterwork of Dark Eldar engineering, swift and deadly, crewed by warriors who had never known defeat. They had conducted dozens of successful raids against Imperial convoys and merchant fleets. This would be no different. "The elders speak of this Dark Eagle as if he were some kind of demigod," Karith laughed, watching his fleet close the distance. "But I see only another Mundaki playing at war with his oversized toys. We'll show them what true masters of the void can do." The tactical officer opened his mouth again, perhaps to offer another warning, but thought better of it. The young Archon's confidence had infected the entire crew, making them eager for the glory of being the ones to prove the old stories wrong. "Prepare boarding parties. I want that ship's secrets laid bare before." The rest of his sentence was lost in a flash of blinding light. In the fraction of a second before his atoms were scattered across the webway, Karith's enhanced senses registered several things. First, what he had dismissed as standard weapon emplacements were anything but. The Sweet Liberty's hull seemed to shimmer and shift, revealing layers upon layers upon layers of weaponry that took Imperial philosophy and cranked it up to 11. Second, the exposed flanks had been nothing of the sort. The escort formation wasn't meant to protect the flagship, it was meant to give it clear firing lines. The Sweet Liberty's response was simultaneous and overwhelming. Every weapon battery that was on its port activated at once, creating a web of energy so dense it appeared solid. Karith's fleet had no time to evade, no chance to demonstrate their vaunted maneuverability. 200 ships, each a masterpiece of Dark Eldar engineering, vanished in a single salvo. From the safety of their spy screens, the great Archons of New Chimerak watched with a mixture of horror and avarice. They saw their sacrificial pawn removed from the board with surgical precision, and in that removal, they saw both warning and promise. Lady Malice observed the destruction through half-lidded eyes, her ever-present fan hiding what might have been a smile. "Ah, youth," she murmured, "always in such a hurry to learn life's hardest lessons." Asdrubal Vex's expression remained carefully neutral, but his fingers tightened imperceptibly on his throne's armrests. The rumors had not been exaggerated after all, if anything, they had understated the Sweet Liberty's power. Such a weapon would indeed change the balance of power in New Chimerak, if it could be claimed. In the webway, the Sweet Liberty's weapons slowly cycled down, the apocalyptic energy of their discharge gradually fading. There was something almost casual about the destruction it had wreaked, as if swatting away Karith's fleet had been no more effort than brushing aside an annoying insect. The lesson was written in fire and void, the Dark Eagle's reputation had been earned in blood and horror, and those who forgot that truth paid for their ignorance with their lives. Caritha's tale would join the others, another cautionary whisper in New Camaraka's halls about the folly of underestimating Franklin Valorian and his terrible ship. But as the other Archons began plotting their own approaches, calculating angles of attack and weighing the cost in expendable lives, they missed the deeper truth that Kralitha's death had revealed. The Sweet Liberty hadn't just destroyed his fleet, it had done so with casual efficiency, like a practiced swordsman dispatching an amateur's clumsy lunge. This wasn't just power. This was power that knew exactly how to use itself. And somewhere in the vast cathedral ship's corridors, Franklin Valorian smiled, knowing that the real battle was only just beginning. The Dark Eldar would learn, as they had before, why the Sweet Liberty's name was spoken with such fear in the shadows of their new home. Some lessons, after all, had to be taught again and again, written in fire and death until they could never be forgotten. Chapter 133, Ashes and Shadows. The Third Temple burned beneath a sky stained with unnatural colors, its corrupt spires cracking under the relentless bombardment of Liberty Eagle strike craft. Franklin Valorian stood amidst the devastation, his armor reflecting the fires of purification that raged around him. The last word hung at his side, while Anaris thrummed with the fury of a god, its surface rippling with patterns that spoke of ancient Eldari might. The air itself seemed to scream as orbital bombardment came from the Sweet Liberty and her fleet, carving surgical strikes through concentrations of Slaaneshi demons. Keeper of Secrets, Greater Daemon of the Dark Prince, attempted to marshal its forces, but found itself facing the full fury of a Primarch's wrath. The creature's multiple arms whirled in a deadly dance, each holding a blade that could easily bisect any space marine, yet it faced something beyond its strength. Franklin moved like lightning made manifest. Anaris met the daemon's blades in a cascade of sparks that spoke of colliding realities. Each clash sent shockwaves through the corrupted ground, creating craters in the already scarred earth. The Keeper's eyes, filled with eldritch knowledge and forbidden desires, widened in something approaching fear as it realized too late the true nature of its opponent. Liberty or death. The war cry echoed across the battlefield as Liberty Guard units holding in perfect formation, their Liberty pattern combi bolters creating corridors of absolute destruction through ranks of daemonettes. Doomsday grav tanks decimated the opposing army in coordinated fire. The flashes of light burned with a golden tinge, as if the Emperor's own light had been captured and weaponized. The Keeper of Secrets made its final mistake, launching a desperate assault at Franklin's exposed flank. In one fluid motion, beyond the speed of mortal sight, Anaris described an arc of pure light. The daemon's head, still wearing an expression of sublime arrogance, tumbled through the air before both it and its body dissolved into oblivion. It was then that John Ezra's voice cut through the vox. "My lord, Dark Eldar signatures detected on multiple vectors. They're using the temple's destruction as cover for their approach." Franklin's enhanced vision caught the movement Drukari jet bikes, their riders leaning low over Baroque control panels, weapons already tracking a squad of Liberty Guard who were finishing off the last knots of demonic resistance. Time seemed to slow as the Primarch raised the last word. His eyes blazed with internal fire, golden light spilling from them like solar flares. One pull of the trigger, one perfectly calculated shot, the bullet split apart in mid-flight, becoming 10 separate projectiles, each finding its mark with devastating precision. The jet bikes exploded in a chain of destruction, their riders atomized before they could even register their doom. The battle transformed then, shifting from daemon hunting to a new kind of war. The Dark Eldar attacked with all the sadistic creativity their race was infamous for. Durgul packs burst from hidden pockets of the webway, their pale forms writhing with unnatural hunger. Clawed fiends bounded across the battlefield on powerful limbs, while hell spiders skittered through the ruins, seeking prey. Above, razor wings wheeled and dove, their sharp cries cutting through the din of battle. But the Liberty Eagles were ready. Surface-to-air missile batteries, carrying flak missiles, land-seeking missiles, activated in perfect synchronization, their targeting systems guided by the mechanical precision of Golden Age tech. The sky itself seemed to ignite as thousands of missiles traced elegant death paths through the air. Flak tanks added their own fury to the barrage, filling the air with such density of fire that it appeared like solid clouds of fury. The grotesques came next, twisted abominations that had once been living beings before the homunculi worked their horrible art. Their massive, mutated forms lumbered forward, accompanied by racks who moved with the delicate precision of torture artists. Behind them floated Talos pain engines, their organic components pulsing with malevolent life. Yet for all their horror, they faced an army that had been forged in the crucible of countless wars. Liberty Guard veterans, laid down overlapping fields of fire. Every position had been calculated by Director Jackson's tactical matrices, every firing lane pre-sighted and prepared. The Dark Eldar found themselves channeled into killing grounds where the combined firepower of Guard and Astartes created zones of absolute death. Franklin watched from his vantage point, his transhuman mind processing battlefield data at impossible speeds. He saw the pattern in the enemy's attack, how they sacrificed their beasts and slaves first, probing for weaknesses. The Beastmasters remained distant, directing their charges from safety, while Kabbalite warriors waited for opportunities to strike at exposed flanks. Then came the shadows. Franklin felt them before he saw them: mandrakes, those strange entities that existed between realms. They moved like liquid darkness, their bodies seemingly made of living shadow. Their attempt at ambush was perfect by any mortal standard, approaching unseen through dimensions that existed just adjacent to reality. But Franklin was far from mortal. An arrow moved in a circular arc, its blade describing a perfect circle of golden light. The mandrakes, caught in mid-strike, found their shadowy forms bisected by ancient Eldari psychocrystal. Unlike their normal deaths, which usually left them to dissolve back into shadow, Anaris's touch turned them to dust, a true death from which there would be no return. The battle continued to rage across three fronts, with John Ezra commanding the anti-chaos operations while Jackson directed the ground forces against the Dark Eldar incursion. Above, Battlefleet Liberty was engaging in a winning void war. When the retreat finally came, it was the Dark Eldar who broke first. Their losses had been catastrophic, their carefully laid plans shattered against the immovable object that was Franklin Valorian and his Liberty Eagles. The surviving beasts were called back, Kabbalite warriors vanished into flickering webway pockets, and the shadows themselves seemed to retreat from the battlefield. Franklin watched them go, Anaris still crackling with energy in his grip. The battlefield around him was transformed craters from orbital strikes, still burning promethium and phosphex fires, the dissolving remains of demons, and the twisted wreckage of Dark Eldar war machines. His Liberty Eagles and Guard moved with practiced efficiency, securing the area and establishing defensive positions in case of another attack. The Third Temple's cleansing was complete, but Franklin knew this was merely the opening move in a larger game. The Dark Eldar had committed significant forces to this attack, suggesting a level of coordination that was unusual for their fractious race. His mere presence in the webway alone had united them, driven them to take such risks. As the last of the Drukhari retreated, Franklin activated his command vox. Jackson, begin full spectrum analysis of the battlefield data. I want to know everything about their attack patterns, their unit compositions, and especially any unusual tactical formations. John, coordinate with Jackson to establish a predictive model for their next move. They'll be back, and next time, they won't waste their fodder testing our defenses. The responses came back crisp and immediate, his commanders already moving to execute his orders. Above, the Sweet Liberty's massive form blocked out the stars, its weapon batteries still glowing from recent discharge. Another battle won, but the war, this strange, new conflict with the Dark Eldar, was just beginning. In the twisted spires of New Kamaruk, where Shadow and Malice danced an eternal waltz, the minor Archon Charis dragged his broken body through the serpentine corridors of Lady Malice's palace. Blood his own, for once left a trail of iridescent droplets on marble floors that seemed to drink the liquid with eager thirst. The wounds he bore were badges of survival, each telling its own tale of narrow escape from the Liberty Eagles' killing grounds. The palace itself was a monument to calculated excess, its architecture an impossible fusion of beauty and cruelty. Crystallized screams formed delicate archways, while fountains of stolen souls cast their ethereal light across walls decorated with moving murals of eternal torment. Even the air carried weight here, thick with poisonous promise and perfumed malice. Incubi guards flanked the approach to Lady Malice's throne room, their armor drinking in what little light reached these shadowed halls. Their helmets, crafted in the visage of the Eldar war god, betrayed no emotion as they watched Charis approach. Each warrior stood perfectly still, yet radiated such lethal intent that even battle-hardened raiders gave them wide berth. The Clavakes, leader of Lady Malice's incubi retinue, stepped forward with liquid grace. His armor, more ornate than his brother's, bore the scars of 1,000 duels, each mark a testament to victories over those who had failed to show proper respect to his mistress. The massive clave in his hands hummed with barely contained energy, eager to separate soul from flesh. "You are expected," the Clavakes' voice emerged from his helm like silk over steel. "Mind your protocols, Lesser One, or I shall mind them for you." Charis felt the phantom pain of his own incubi's death. His soul guardian, purchased with decades of careful hoarding, had been reduced to atoms by Liberty Eagle fire. Such protection was beyond his means now, and its absence left him feeling naked before these supreme killers. The throne room itself was a study in calculated intimidation. Floating platforms held writhing sculptures crafted from still living flesh, their surfaces rippling in patterns that spoke of infinite agony. The air was heavy with exotic toxins, not enough to kill, but sufficient to keep visitors alert with the knowledge that every breath could be their last. "Speak," Lady Malice commanded, her voice a velvety drawl that promised both ecstasy and annihilation. Her bladed fan traced languid, hypnotic arcs through the air, each movement deliberate and mesmerizing, as if the fan were an extension of her very will. The subtle rustle of her robes, woven from shadow and the faint shimmer of captured starlight, added to the disorienting beauty of her presence. Beside her, Draken Nazir stood with the rigid posture of one who had survived countless assassination attempts through perfect vigilance. Charis swallowed, his throat working against the fear that threatened to steal his voice. "My lady, I have witnessed the Dark Eagle's work firsthand. They move with purpose through the webway, sealing breaches with methodical precision. But they are not alone." Lady Malice tilted her head, the movement languid and feline, her lips curving into a smile that was both inviting and terrifying. "Continue. There are others, craft-world Eldari in pure white armor, moving with the certainty of zealots. And harlequins, my lady, their masks reflecting impossible colors as they dance through combat. They follow the Liberty Eagles as if..." He hesitated, his voice faltering under her unblinking gaze, as if they share some common purpose. "Fascinating." Lady Malice rose from her throne with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, her movements slow and sinuous, each step a calculated performance of allure and menace. Her armor clung to her form like liquid midnight, catching the dim light and refracting it into an iridescent play of color that made it impossible to look away. "And the next target?" she purred, her voice dripping with silken curiosity. "The architect of fate's breach, my lady. They move with inevitability, sealing each portal as if following some grand design beyond our comprehension." Lady Malice approached him, her hips swaying in a motion so smooth it was hypnotic, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. Her bladed fan lifted his chin with delicate cruelty, forcing him to meet her gaze. The edge kissed his skin, drawing a single crimson bead of blood that traced a languorous path down his neck. Her smile deepened, a mask of pleasure and malice. "Your rival, as promised, has been eliminated. His realm now lies in ruins, ready for new management." Relief flickered across the Charis face, but it was short-lived. The burning sensation that began at the base of his skull was almost gentle at first, like the teasing caress of a lover, before it exploded into all-consuming agony. He collapsed forward, his body already beginning to dissolve from within. "These vat-grown generations," Lady Malice mused, stepping over the dissolving remains with the languid grace of a cat surveying its prey. Her voice was soft, almost dreamy, yet brimming with derision. "So eager to please, so ready to believe in promises. Don't you agree, Nazir?" Her draken shifted slightly, his every movement as measured and deliberate as hers. "The fires of old Commeric burned away most of the trueborn, my lady. These new ones lack the refined education of their predecessors." Malice's laugh echoed like a silver blade sliding from its sheath, soft, deadly, and deliberate. "Long live the Dark Eagle," she murmured, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the crystalline surface of the window. "Without his purging flames, I might never have risen so effortlessly." She turned to Nazir, her eyes glittering like the edge of a poisoned blade. "Tell me what you know of him, this Franklin Valorian and his independence sector." Nazir chose his words carefully, aware that one misstep could mean his end. "The attack on Old Commeric remains controversial. Some say the Lords of Twilight provoked the Imperium's wrath during their Great Crusade. Others claim the Dark Eagle simply saw an opportunity to prove himself against his brother Primarches. What we know for certain is that he achieves whatever he sets his mind to, with a thoroughness that borders on obsession." Malice's eyes narrowed, the faintest trace of a smirk tugging at her lips. "You would betray me, wouldn't you, Nazir?" "My lady, I..." Her laughter cut him off, sharp and laced with malice. "Of course you would. It's in our nature. Trust is a rare and fragile thing here." She moved closer, her steps deliberate, her presence oppressive. "But as long as I hold the reins of power, your betrayal remains theoretical." Nazir bowed slightly, the movement masking the tension that rippled through his frame. He had seen firsthand how quickly Malice could turn from amusement to execution. Her presence was overwhelming, her scent a heady mix of venomous flowers and bloodied steel. Nazir fought to steady his breathing as the weight of her power settled over him, seductive and suffocating in equal measure. "Shall I continue, my lady?" he asked. "By all means," she replied, turning back to the window, her reflection now a shadowy twin watching over her shoulder. Franklin Valorian is president of the Independence Sector, a state both autonomous and loyal to the Imperium of Man. By all accounts, his leadership has transformed a fractured realm of civil strife into a paradise. Raids on their territories are nearly futile. His forces pursue us even through the webway. The few Archons who've dared to strike his worlds have faced utter annihilation. His armies, they've mastered technologies beyond the comprehension of most Mundane. They've even reverse-engineered Necron technology. At this, Malice's fingers stilled. The ancient menace of the Necrons, those rivals who had nearly undone her people during the War in Heaven, was no mere historical curiosity. Her eyes flickered with a new intensity as Nazir pressed on. "The Independence Sector's technological prowess rivals the finest craft worlds, my lady. Its influence within the Imperium is undeniable. They call it a managed democracy. Valorian himself is." He paused, the word clearly distasteful. "Loved. Revered, even. A public servant to his people." Malice turned, her brow arched in mock surprise. "A public servant? How delightfully alien." "It is an unusual concept," Nazir admitted, his tone neutral. "From what we gather, his citizens adore him. They call him noble, humorous, and fair. He wields power, yet claims to serve those beneath him." "Interesting," Malice murmured, though her tone carried no small amount of irony. She began to pace, her mind crafting possibilities. "And the war effort? The casualties have been massive. This third attack has left many lesser cabals in ruins, and the Beastmasters report dwindling resources as do the homunculi. The Liberty Eagles have suffered some losses, primarily to Mandrake attacks, but..." Nazir paused, choosing his next words carefully. "The Dark Eagle has personally slain every Archon and Incubi who've faced him in single combat." A smile played across Malice's features. "The Hand of Cain, as our craft world can name him. They say Kala Mencha Cain himself resides within that sword of his Anaris." Her fingers traced patterns in the air, as if writing secrets in invisible ink. "Rumors, of course, but our craft world cousins are rarely given to exaggeration in such matters. What is our next move, my lady?" Lady Malice's laughter rippled through the chamber, a sound that made shadows dance and reality tremble. "We test the waters, Nazir. I wish to know this demigod of war personally." Her gaze shifted, sharp and piercing, as if trying to unravel an unseen web. "What of his ultimate intentions? Does he seek to reduce us to ashes, as he did old Kamaruk? Or is there more to this Dark Eagle than mere vengeance?" Nazir hesitated, choosing his words with care. "Uncertain, my lady. The destruction of old Kamaruk was decisive, but it was not without purpose. He is known to favor pragmatism over mindless annihilation. Diplomacy, however slim the chance, may yet hold some appeal to him." Malice's expression flickered, a glimmer of mischief in her eyes. "Diplomacy? With a Primarch? How utterly provocative!" She turned, her steps deliberate and graceful, to a table laden with ancient relics, her fingertips brushing against a twisted shard of wraith bone. "Prepare my retinue, Nazir. We shall approach not as adversaries, but as emissaries." "Emissaries, my lady?" Nazir's voice betrayed the faintest hint of unease. "Yes, Nazir," she said, her tone languid but edged with steel. "Even a demigod must observe the courtesies of civilization. Select only the finest, the most beautiful, the most cunning, and the most dangerous. Let our presence speak of both elegance and menace, a warning and a promise." As the firefalls painted her form in shades of unearthly light, she seemed to embody all that defined the Drukari, the perfect blend of grace and cruelty, beauty and horror, wisdom and madness. In that moment, Malice was no mere Archon, she was a force of nature, poised on the edge of destruction and opportunity. "And Nazir," she added with a sly smile, "ensure our gift for the Dark Eagle is fitting. Something that reflects both our power and our potential as allies." Nazir bowed low and retreated, acutely aware that he had just witnessed the first step of a gamble that could redefine the fate of their race. Left alone, Lady Malice gazed out at the impossible cityscape of New Kamaruk, her reflection shimmering like a mirage in the crystalline glass. "Annihilation or alliance," she murmured, her voice soft but brimming with intrigue. "Let us see, Franklin Valorian, which fate you will offer us under your golden gaze." Chapter 134, Clowns and negotiations. Through the twisting currents of the webway, the Sweet Liberty and her escort fleet carved their path toward the fourth shrine. Once a mighty armada of 1,000 ships, the fleet had been reduced to only 600, a grim indication to the relentless Drukhari attacks. The Dark Eldar's cunning and tenacity had whittled them down, though even the finest fleet of the Imperium could only withstand so much harassment. From the bridge of the Sweet Liberty, Franklin Valorian watched the latest Drukhari assault unfold with a tactician's eye. The Xenos vessels wove between his escort ships with impossible grace, their pilots demonstrating why they were considered the galaxy's most skilled voidfarers. Their strategy was as elegant as it was effective, using the escort vessels as shields against the Sweet Liberty's overwhelming firepower. "You have to admire their tactical prowess," said Henry Cavill, the third captain, his voice tinged with reluctant respect as he observed the battle. His fingers traced the movements of the ships on the tactical display. "They're using our own formations against us. Every assault is calculated to force us into a position where we either hold our fire or risk hitting our own ships." Fleet Admiral Koshka, her face bathed in the glow of the holograms, grimaced. "If we shift our formation to clear our firing lanes, we leave the Sweet Liberty exposed. They've trapped us in a perfect zugzwang." Her eyes flicked to a particular ship on the tactical screen. "Though, some of them get overconfident." As if on cue, a single Drukhari vessel broke from the coordinated assault, its pilot attempting a series of dizzying maneuvers meant to bait the Sweet Liberty into firing. But the massive Imperial vessel stood still, unflinching, waiting for the perfect shot. The moment the Xenos vessel crossed an invisible line, a brief flash of light flared, and what had once been a sleek, deadly craft was now nothing more than azure particles drifting in the void. "Confidence," Franklin muttered with a wry smile, "has always been the downfall of the overzealous." The battle raged on, but its outcome was never truly in doubt. For every 100 ships the Imperial fleet lost, 10 times as many Drukhari vessels were reduced to scrap or vapor. Inside the Sweet Liberty, boarding parties met swift ends in the labyrinthine corridors, their bodies along with the grotesque creations of their homunculi masters adding further ornamentation to the vessel's already macabre interior. Reports crackled through the Vox. Denzel Washington's voice was firm and clipped, "Port sectors cleared. Those knife ears brought some nasty toys, but we handled it." Armstrong's report followed, "Starboard's clear. Not really a challenge." Lastly, Vladimir's psychic voice cut through, thick with a stereotypical Russian stoicism and a hint of icy satisfaction, "Central corridors cleared. Their souls? Redirected. Is problem no more." When the Sweet Liberty finally reached the fourth shrine, the orbital bombardment began with clinical precision. The guns of the Imperial ship roared with the force of human technological supremacy, but the servants of Psi-inch below were no mere mortals. The changer of ways had left his mark on the place, and reality itself seemed to twist under the bombardment, resisting the impact of the guns. "Their psychic defenses are stronger than anticipated," Vladimir reported, his mental tone strained as he and his technosers established a psychic firewall around the landing zones. "These aren't your average Psi-inch cultists. The greater daemon here is sophisticated." Franklin's response was brief but decisive, "Then let's go introduce ourselves properly." The descent to the shrine's surface was a chaotic swirl of technicolor madness. Psi-inch sorcery buckled reality, attempting to drag the monoliths into alternate dimensions or warp them into bizarre, nonsensical shapes. Technoseer protective wards held just barely, creating a narrow thread of sanity through the tumult. Franklin, as ever, made his assault personal. The Lord of Change awaited him in the shrine's central sanctuary, now transformed into a maze of crystalline structures and impossible geometries, eyes watching from every conceivable angle. The greater daemon was a magnificent horror, a nightmare of feathers shimmering with every shade of madness, its staff crackling with energies potent enough to unravel the very fabric of reality. It regarded Franklin with the insufferable smugness that only a creature of the warp could muster. Then it spoke, its voice reverberating with an absurdity so profound that it momentarily arrested even Franklin's calculating mind: testicular torsion. Franklin's counterspell was instant. Franklin's brow arched sharply, his smirk curling into something dark and sardonic. With deliberate enunciation and a voice dripping in disdain, he retorted, "You dare use my own spells against me, Daemon? How unimaginative!" The Lord of Change laughed, its voice echoing through dimensions that had no business intersecting with reality. "Your counter is impressive, Hand of Cain, but futile. I possess no such mortal weaknesses. No human organs to twist." Franklin's smile widened, a grin that would have made a Drukhari Archon nervous. "Is that so?" His hand extended towards the greater daemon, tapping into the raw energies of the warp. Create testicles. The daemon's expression shifted from superiority to confusion to genuine horror as it suddenly found itself endowed with very specific human anatomy. Franklin's follow-up was swift and inevitable: testicular torsion. The resulting shriek of agony from the Lord of Change echoed across several dimensions, a sound never before heard in the galaxy. It was a moment so bizarre that even the warp itself recoiled. Franklin, however, showed no mercy, his sword flashing in the air and separating the daemon's head from its body, granting it mercy of true death. As the shrine began to collapse, reality slowly reasserting itself, Franklin felt Cain's presence in his mind. The god of war's voice was a mixture of exasperation and reluctant amusement. In all my eons, Cain intoned, in all the battles I have witnessed, that was perhaps the most dishonorable and obnoxious victory I have ever had the displeasure of observing besides you and your other self a few years ago. Franklin sheathed his sword, watching the last traces of Tsianch's corruption fade. Hey, he started it. Besides, you have to admit it was effective. Effective? Cain's voice struggled to maintain its usual ancient dignity. You created reproductive organs on a being of pure warp energy for the sole purpose of inflicting specific physical trauma. Exactly, Franklin replied cheerfully. Classic problems require creative solutions. And you have to admit, he won't be expecting that trick again. No, Cain conceded, I don't imagine it can anymore. There was a pause, and Franklin could almost feel the god of war's struggle with his own sense of dignity. Though I suspect Seguruk is already entertained by this. As the Liberty Eagles secured the shrine and began the purification process, Franklin couldn't suppress a grin. Sometimes, the best way to handle the galaxy's horrors was to remind them that humanity could be just as creative in its methods of war, if not more so. Next time, he promised Cain, I'll go for something more traditional. Maybe just turn him into a chicken. The god of war's only response was a long-suffering sigh, the kind that only the ancient and weary could truly understand. But Franklin could almost feel the god's amusement behind it, a silent acknowledgement of the unconventional brilliance of his victory. In the aftermath of battle, as reality settled back into its proper shape around the cleansed shrine, Franklin Valorian noticed a curious figure in the distance. The laughing god, Seguruk, was performing what appeared to be the final steps of an intricate dance, his motley costume shimmering with colors that shouldn't exist as he sewed the last remnants of the warp breach. The gesture was both precise and theatrical, like a master performer taking their final bow. Then, in the way that gods of mischief are wont to do, Seguruk vanished. Behind you! Sang a melodious voice that somehow managed to contain both infinite wisdom and the energy of a caffeinated circus performer. Franklin turned to find the laughing god lounging impossibly in mid-air, his mask sporting what could only be described as the universe's most self-satisfied grin. His motley shifted and changed with each movement, creating patterns that told jokes in a visual language that hurt the eyes to comprehend. Oh good, you're here, Seguruk said, his voice carrying the cadence of someone about to deliver their favorite joke. Tell me, young champion, what do you call a Primarch in motley who walks into a library? Franklin, who had learned long ago that the best way to deal with divine beings who spoke in riddles was to play along, considered for a moment. I don't know, a scholarly harlequin. Seguruk's laugh echoed across several dimensions simultaneously. A booking agent. Bazinga. The god's laughter continued, accompanied by the sound of what might have been a cosmic laugh track. Franklin couldn't help but wonder if somewhere in the multiverse, there was a studio audience groaning at the pun. Get it? Because he's an agent, who's booking, and you're about to. Seguruk wiped an impossible tear from his mask. Oh, I've been saving that one since before your father was Alexander the Great. Before Franklin could respond, the air beside him began to move in ways that air really shouldn't. A solitaire materialized, their presence both there and not there, their movements telling a story of ancient wisdom and cosmic jest. They performed a dance that seemed to bend space itself, each gesture containing meanings that operated on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. With a flourish that somehow managed to be both elegant and slightly ridiculous, the solitaire presented two items to Franklin. The first was a card that seemed to be made of shadows and starlight, a library card for the Black Library, the repository of all Eldari knowledge about chaos and then some. The second was a set of garments that could only be described as a harlequin troop master's outfit, complete with a mask that seemed to be winking. Franklin accepted both items, examining the garb with a mixture of curiosity and mild concern. He opened his mouth to ask what exactly he was supposed to do with a cosmic jester's outfit, but the solitaire had already begun another dance. This one seemed to say, with the eloquence that only interpretive dance can achieve, the laughing god awaits you in the library, and yes, he's probably going to make more puns. The solitaire's gestures became more specific, pointing to the library card with movements that somehow managed to convey both cosmic significance and you might want to hurry before he comes up with more jokes. As both the solitaire and the last echoes of Segurika's laughter faded away, Franklin stood there holding what amounted to an invitation to the galaxy's most exclusive library and what appeared to be cosmic cosplay attire. Cain's presence stirred in his mind, and Franklin could have sworn he felt the war god suppress a divine sigh. "Don't," Franklin said to the sword at his hip, "even start." The sword pulsed with what might have been amusement. The god of war had opinions about the laughing god's methods, but even he had to admit that Segurika's ways, while extraordinarily theatrical, tended to achieve their goals. Looking at the library card once more, Franklin couldn't help but smile. Somewhere in the webway, in a craft world, the laughing god was probably already preparing his next round of cosmic dad jokes. And somehow, for reasons that probably made sense only to a being who treated the universe as his personal comedy club, Franklin had been deemed worthy of being part of the audience. Well, he mused, tucking both items away safely, at least it'll be more entertaining than Tsianch's idea of humor. The mask in the bundle seemed to wink at him again, and Franklin made a mental note to check it for actual sentience later. When dealing with gifts from the laughing god, it was always best to assume everything was either a joke, a test, or both simultaneously. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all. And it was wearing motley. In the aftermath of battle, amid the lingering sense of ozone and blood, Denzel Washington approached Franklin with his characteristic measured stride. The first captain's expression carried a hint of bemusement as he delivered his report. "My lord," Denzel said, "we have an unusual visitor. A draken from the cabal of the Poisoned Tongue requests an audience. He brings an invitation." Franklin nodded, his massive form still bearing the ethereal traces of his recent battle. "Escort him to me." With deliberate ceremony, he took an arrow and planted it point down into the ground before him. The sword's presence sent ripples through reality itself, its divine essence making even battle-hardened aspect warriors feel a deep, primordial unease. The gathered Primarch captains formed a loose semicircle around their Primarch, their armor still bearing fresh marks from the recent combat. Through their midst came the draken, his movements carrying the lethal grace typical of his kind. What was not typical, however, was the formal military salute he offered to Franklin, a gesture that drew raised eyebrows from the assembled Primarch. Franklin's gaze fell upon the dark Eldar envoy, and Nazir felt the full weight of a demigod's attention. It was like standing before a son that had learned to think, to judge, and to kill. The draken's enhanced physiology registered dozens of threat responses, his body recognizing dangers his conscious mind couldn't fully process. "I am Nazir," he managed, his voice remarkably steady despite the pressure, "draken in service to Lady Aurelia Malice." "Malice?" Franklin's voice carried genuine curiosity. "What does Vex consort want with me?" Something in Nazir's posture shifted, and despite the overwhelming presence before him, he found himself compelled to correct the Primarch. "My lady is not a consort to Esdrubal Vecht, Lord Primarch." Understanding flickered across Franklin's features. The butterfly effects of his actions in this timeline continued to surprise him. "My apologies," he offered, though the words did little to ease Nazir's discomfort. The draken could feel his soul being inexorably drawn toward Anaris, the sword's hunger unmistakable. The weapon wasn't just a blade, it was a door through which divinity peered into reality, and that divinity had a particular appetite for Eldar souls. Nazir forced himself to focus on his mission. "Lady Malice would have you dictate the location of the meeting, Lord Primarch," he said quickly, the words tumbling out as he fought against the sword's pull. A smirk played across Franklin's features. "Even if I set the meeting place on Terra? Or Nova Libertas itself?" Nazir nodded, maintaining his composure through sheer force of will. "My lady would attend regardless of the location." Franklin's laugh carried genuine appreciation. "I doubt that, given the society you drookery live in. But let's say she would come, having me dictate the meeting place is quite the power move." He studied the draken with renewed interest. "Either Lady Malice is fearless or foolish. Either way, I respect the gall it takes to invite your most terrible enemy to a negotiation table." The Primarch seemed to come to a decision. "The meeting will take place on Atlantis, a libertine pleasure world at the border between the Imperium and the Independence sector. It's currently private, not yet open for business, completely neutral ground." Then, with casual grace that belied the gruesomeness of the gesture, Franklin presented several severed heads, the remains of archons and incubi he had personally slain in single combat. A gift, for not quivering in fear in the mere presence of Cain and myself. At the mention of Cain's name, reality shuddered. Behind Nazir, the air ignited into divine flames, coalescing into the manifested form of the Eldar god of war and murder. A bloody hand descended onto the dragon's shoulder, leaving a crimson imprint that sizzled against his armor, the mark of a god's touch, a blessing that felt more like a curse. Nazir's training, his enhanced physiology, and every survival instinct bred into his kind over millennia screamed at him to flee. Yet he held his ground, fighting against the primal terror that came with standing between a Primarch and a god. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the grisly gifts, but he managed to maintain enough dignity to bow before making his departure, though his pace as he walked away betrayed his desperate desire to escape. Franklin watched the dragon's hasty retreat with amusement, turning to the still manifested form of Cain. "You didn't have to scare the poor bastard like that." The god of war and murder's response was a simple snicker, the sound carrying echoes of ancient battlefields and countless duels. Then, with an almost casual malice, Cain added, "Fear makes a drookery soul spicier." The Primi-born captains watched the exchange between their Primarch and the manifested god with a mixture of awe and bemusement. It was moments like these that reminded them that their Gene-father was not just a supreme military commander or a leader of unprecedented capability, he was something more, something that straddled the line between humanity and divinity, capable of bantering with gods while coordinating galactic warfare. As Cain's manifestation faded back into the divine fires from which it had emerged, Franklin cast one last look in the direction the dragon had departed. The upcoming meeting with Lady Malice promised to be interesting, a meeting of diplomacy between powers that understood the art of both war and manipulation. The fact that she had chosen such a bold opening move suggested she was either supremely confident or had already set plans in motion that he couldn't yet see. Either way, Franklin mused, it would make a welcome change from the straightforward brutality of their recent battles. Sometimes the most dangerous games were played not with swords and guns, but with words and calculated gestures. And in those games, even the gods themselves were sometimes merely pieces on the board. Chapter 135, A Meeting of Cunning. The vast command bridge of the Sweet Liberty hummed with subdued energy as hololithic displays cast a pale blue glow across the gathered officers' faces. Primarch Franklin Valorian sat at the head of the ornate obsidian table, his massive frame dwarfing the command throne specifically constructed for his use. Before him, a series of detailed after-action reports scrolled through the air, each casualty figure adding weight to his already grim expression. The losses were substantial, several million dead, with half the escort fleet reduced to twisted debris floating in the void. Each number represented not just a statistic, but sons and daughters of liberty who would never return home. Franklin's fingers drummed against the table's surface, the sound echoing through the chamber like distant thunder. "What have we learned from this operation?" His voice carried across the bridge, firm but tinged with the determination to prevent such losses in future engagements. Fleet Admiral Elena Koshka rose first. Despite the fatigue evident in her eyes, her voice remained steady as she began her analysis. "My lord, the combat data reveals significant tactical oversights in our fleet composition when engaging drookery forces within the webway," she began, gesturing to a hololithic display showing various ship formations. "Our reliance on capital ships, particularly battleships and battlecruisers, proved more detrimental than beneficial. Their superior batteries, while devastating in conventional void warfare, became liabilities against such agile opponents." The display shifted, showing recordings of dark Eldar raiders weaving between the massive Imperial vessels like fish through coral reefs. The drookery's speed and maneuverability allowed them to exploit gaps in our formation that wouldn't exist with a more compact fleet structure. They turned our own size against us, using our larger vessels as cover while picking apart our escort ships. Koshka manipulated the display, bringing up a proposed new fleet configuration. "I recommend a substantial shift in our approach when engaging these Xenos in their own territory. Speed versus speed, closer range engagements rather than long-range exchanges. We should increase our focus on cruiser and destroyer operations, supported by the Sweet Liberty as our primary carrier and command vessel." Franklin nodded thoughtfully, studying the proposed formations. "Begin implementing these configurations for future operations. We'll need extensive drills to adapt our crews to these new tactics." "What's the estimated time frame for full implementation?" 3 to 4 months for preliminary adaptation, sir. Full integration and crew familiarization would take approximately 8 months. As Koshka resumed her seat, Yamato Nakajima, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, stood next. His uniform bore the distinctive insignia of the Armored Corps Division, a relatively new addition to Liberty Eagle's military. Sir, the Armored Corps trials exceeded all expectations, Nakajima began, bringing up combat footage. Massive humanoid machines danced through the void, landing on enemy vessels to neutralize weapons and command centers. These units demonstrated remarkable effectiveness against enemy ships, Nakajima explained, showing an armored core tearing through a Drukari vessel's hull. While larger than conventional fighters, their performance surpasses torpedo attacks and bomber squadrons in key scenarios. Armored cores working with fighters created devastating results. Franklin leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Show me the production requirements and timeline for mass implementation. Nakajima quickly brought up the relevant data. With our current industrial capacity, we could begin full-scale production within 2 months. The pilots would have to be specially tailored from the Liberty Guard template. Approved, Franklin declared. Begin immediate production and establish a dedicated training program. Contact either Dr. Chen or Magos Biceps for the genetic tailoring. I want regular progress reports on pilot certification rates. Finally, General Marcus Graves of the Army rose to speak, his scarred face testament to decades of ground combat experience. My lord, regarding ground operations against the Drukari, our forces demonstrated overwhelming superiority in most engagements. The combination of Astartes and Liberty Guard proved particularly effective against Kabbalite warriors and other homunculi aberrations. Graves activated a tactical display showing various ground battles. Our losses were primarily concentrated around Mandrake attacks. These shadow-wielding assassins proved particularly troublesome, exploiting gaps in our detection systems to strike at command and control elements. The display showed several instances where Mandrakes emerged from seemingly nowhere, causing chaos before disappearing again. I recommend prioritizing research into counter-Mandrake detection and engagement systems. Our current Auspex technology seems insufficient against their shadow-walking capabilities. Franklin's expression darkened at the mention of the Mandrakes. Agreed. I'll have our research divisions prioritize this immediately. In the meantime, what temporary countermeasures can we implement? We've had some success with overlapping fields of fire and modified motion trackers, Graves replied. It's not perfect, but it's reduced our vulnerability somewhat. The Technoseers have also developed some promising psychic detection methods, though they're still in the testing phase. The Primarch absorbed all this information, his tactical mind already formulating adjustments to their military doctrine. Very well. I want detailed implementation plans for all these recommendations within 48 hours. Elena, work with Yamato to integrate the new fleet compositions with armored core deployment patterns. Marcus, coordinate with the Technoseers to expedite those detection systems. We'll reconvene in 1 week to review progress. As his officers began to rise, Franklin added one final thought. The Drukari are formidable opponents, but they've shown us our weaknesses. We'll adapt, we'll improve, and next time, we'll be better prepared. Remember, every casualty figure represents someone's child, parent, or sibling. We owe it to them to learn from this engagement. The command staff nodded solemnly, each feeling the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. As they filed out to begin implementing their respective tasks, Franklin remained at the table, studying the casualty reports once more. The Liberty Eagles had always prided themselves on achieving victory with minimal losses. This operation had been a harsh reminder that being relaxed and underestimating opponents could result in tragic costs. The vintage chamber aboard the Sweet Liberty carried an atmosphere far removed from the stern military efficiency that dominated the rest of the massive vessel. Rich mahogany panels lined the walls, their surfaces adorned with artifacts from 100 conquered worlds. The soft glow of ancient Terran Edison bulbs cast a warm light across the gathered warriors, their massive forms somehow managing to look comfortable in custom-crafted chairs that would have dwarfed ordinary men. Franklin reclined in his seat, savoring the complex notes of a Liberton cigar. The smoke curled upward in lazy spirals, creating ethereal patterns in the air. Before him, an ornate table crafted from recovered archaeotech bore a collection of bottles and glasses that would have made even the most dedicated Fenrician mead hall keeper envious. He took a slow sip of his Liberton whiskey, letting the fiery warmth settle before speaking. A cigar smoldered between his fingers, the ember glowing like a beacon of relaxation. He exhaled a plume of smoke that curled upward, momentarily forming the shape of an aquila before it dissipated. So, Franklin began, his smirk practically audible. Lady Malice. The data slate says she's charming, manipulative, and only slightly less dangerous than giving a bolter to an orc and telling him to figure it out. What do you think, boys? Before anyone could respond, Samuel L. Jackson leaned back, feet propped up on the edge of the table. Tall, brown, and handsome, meeting a tall, pale, and deadly babe. He gave Franklin an exaggerated once-over. You better watch out, Frank. With that gene seed package of yours, you're her type. Hell, you're everybody's type. I mean, if I wasn't already married to my job. Focus, Jackson, interrupted Denzel Washington, the first captain, though his lips twitched in amusement. Ever the calm center of the storm, Denzel exuded the kind of cool that made enemies nervous and allies grateful. The poisoned tongue isn't about charm, it's about strategy. She doesn't flirt unless it serves a purpose. Jackson raised a hand, mock serious. And what if her purpose is to get a taste of liberty's finest? He wagged his eyebrows at Franklin, who simply rolled his eyes and took another drag of his cigar. Speaking of taste, Stephen Armstrong, second captain, walking testosterone factory, an all-around madman, slammed his glass on the table with enough force to make the stabilizers groan. Do we really have to sit around sipping drinks and talking about Xenos? If she tries anything funny, we punch her in the face and burn her city down again. Problem solved. Franklin chuckled, blowing a perfect smoke ring. I love your subtlety, Stephen. Truly, you're a poet. Henry Cavill, ever the gentleman, swirled his drink thoughtfully. Lady Malice is no fool. Every move she makes is calculated, but the same can be said to every other archon on her caliber. But, he added, glancing at Franklin with a raised brow, you do have a way of disarming even the sharpest minds. Maybe your charisma will prove to be our greatest weapon. Ah yes, the weaponized smolder, Franklin quipped, tilting his head to give Henry a mockingly exaggerated heroic pose. Careful, Henry, or Malice might set her sights on you instead. What's the data slate say about your type? Henry grinned, raising his glass. Not Xenos, that's for sure. Boring. Jackson interjected. You've got to expand your horizons, brother. Eldari women are like fine wine, sharp, sophisticated, and guaranteed to mess you up if you drink too much. He gestured dramatically, eliciting a few chuckles. Vladimir let out a deep laugh that sounded more like distant thunder. You drink too much of anything, Samuel. Drookery is snakes, day. Better to watch from distance. If we do not like what we see, we burn their new city too. Burn it. Franklin grinned. Vova, I've seen you light a campfire with your mind. You're like a walking flamethrower. Flamethrower better at parties, Vladimir deadpanned, drawing a round of laughter. John Ezra, ever silent, continued cleaning his bolt gun with meticulous precision. Jackson leaned over, nudging him with an elbow. What do you think, Johnny boy? Eldar women hot or not? Ezra's lips quirked into a faint smile, but he didn't answer. That's a yes, Jackson declared triumphantly. Franklin held up a hand, cutting through the laughter. All right, back on topic. Malice is dangerous, yes. Charming, yes. And yes, Jackson, I'll be on my best behavior, though I make no promises about resisting her wiles. It's hard being this handsome. You're preaching to the choir, Frank, Jackson shot back, gesturing to himself. We're all out here looking like gods among men. Hell, even Ezra's got that mysterious, brooding thing going on. She isn't prepared for this. Franklin took another draw from his cigar, letting the moment of levity settle before steering the conversation back to strategy. He swirled his whiskey in its glass, watching the liquid catch the warm light. I'm considering offering her a deal, he revealed, watching his officers' reactions carefully. We need eyes inside their new power structure, and while she's about as predictable as a warp storm, that very unpredictability could make her valuable. He gestured to the hololithic display hovering above the table, showing the current deployment of Men of Iron drones throughout the webway. The drones are effective, but they can't catch everything. Sometimes you need an insider's perspective, even if that insider would sell you out for the right price. The Primiborn exchanged glances, centuries of battlefield brotherhood allowing them to communicate volumes without words. One by one, they nodded not in enthusiasm, but in understanding of the strategic necessity. Each took a sip from their glasses, the collective gesture reinforcing their shared resolve. A unanimous decision then, Franklin declared, reaching for one of the bottles. Though I notice none of you seem particularly happy about it. He began pouring generous measures into each glass, the liquid catching the light like liquid gold. Happiness is overrated, Lord, Denzel offered with a slight smile, taking a measured sip from his refilled glass. We trust your judgment, even when it involves dealing with Xenos who would traditionally be on the business end of our bolters. To questionable alliances then, Franklin raised his glass, his eyes twinkling with both humor and calculation. And to hoping this particular snake bites our enemies more often than she bites us. To questionable alliances. The chamber echoed with the sound of clinking glasses and laughter. As the gathering continued into the night, the conversation drifted to other topics: battle stories, jokes about particularly stuffy Mechanicum adepts, and the latest modifications to their war gear. Cigars were relit, glasses refilled, and the rich aroma of Liberton tobacco mingled with the tang of fine spirits, creating an atmosphere of camaraderie and shared purpose. Yet underlying it all was the weight of the coming meeting with Lady Malice, and the knowledge that they were embarking on a game of manipulation and counter-manipulation that would make even the most seasoned imperial politician's head spin. 840.30 m. Liberton Pleasure World, Atlantis. The Stormbirds descended through crystalline skies, their ancient engines singing songs of arrival that echoed across marble spires and golden domes. Atlantis spread before them like a jewel cast upon velvet, a testament to human perseverance and the transformative power of technology. Where once molten rivers had carved valleys of death, now fountains of living water sparkled in sunlight. Liberty Guard units unfurled with seamless precision, as they secured the perimeter. Franklin stood like a titan amid the orchestrated tumult of the deployment. His mere presence seemed to shift the very atmosphere, pulling every gaze while simultaneously forcing them to look away. By his side, standing both proud and visibly unsettled, was the planetary governor. The governor's posture spoke volumes to Franklin's practiced gaze. Here was a man who had worn a uniform far longer than he'd donned the robes of governance. His silvery hair and apparent age of 60 standard years masked what Franklin suspected was a much longer life, preserved by the costly life extension procedures that were a coveted privilege in the independence sector. The unconscious military poise he held was as unmistakable as any ancient record. "I trust our drookery guests have not been disruptive." Franklin's voice carried a tone that combined authority with genuine curiosity. The governor's instinctive salute, emotion honed through decades of service, prompted a knowing smile from the Primarch. "Are you a veteran?" Franklin asked, though he had already surmised the answer. "Yes, by your grace and policies," the governor answered, his voice steady despite the awe he couldn't entirely conceal. 100 years of service, after which I claimed my pension in a single payout. It was enough to secure this planet. The mention of a century's service piqued Franklin's interest. This man had been in service long before the unification of the independence sector, surviving through the turbulent years of consolidation. Death World? Franklin probed, his mind already processing the implications. "Yes, sir. I was fortunate to acquire outdated terraforming technology through the government's planetary uplift program." Franklin's memory flickered to the policy he'd enacted, selling obsolete terraforming technology at discounted rates to stimulate the development of hostile worlds. Yet, the paradise before him spoke of results far beyond what such technology alone should have yielded. What was this world like originally? "Desolate and molten, sir. A wasteland." The realization struck Franklin. A true death world, unforgiving yet not entirely beyond transformation. With enough resolve and the right resources, even obsolete terraforming tech could reshape such a world into something livable. This man had seized that opportunity and surpassed all expectations. The Primarch placed a hand on the governor's shoulder, a gesture both paternal and professional. "Thank you for your service, citizen," he said, the words bearing weight far beyond mere civility. They were a recognition of dedication that spanned centuries. "No, sir," the governor replied, emotion cracking through his disciplined exterior. "Thank you for uniting the sector, for shaping it into an egalitarian state." The words were not flattery, they carried the weight of someone who had lived through the before and after, who fully understood what had been achieved. Franklin's tactical mind never ceased its calculations, even in moments of such recognition. "I trust the drookery haven't given you any trouble." "No, sir. Surprisingly, they've been well-mannered, even with the majority of the PDF stationed in this city." The governor's words confirmed Franklin's suspicions. Lady Malice was playing a different game, keeping her forces unusually restrained. In some ways, this was more unsettling than the usual dark Eldar chaos. "Would you object to using your planet for a particularly sensitive meeting?" Franklin asked, though they both knew the question was little more than formality. "Not at all, sir," the governor replied smoothly, adding with careful precision, "though, if I may request your endorsement for this establishment." Franklin's smile grew slightly. The governor might have been a career soldier, but he clearly understood the art of opportunity. A Primarch's endorsement could elevate a mere pleasure world into a prestigious destination. It was a clever, ambitious request, bold but not overreaching, opportunistic yet respectful. "Consider it granted," Franklin replied, appreciating both the timing and audacity of the request. In the game he was about to play with Lady Malice, having a well-appointed neutral ground could prove invaluable. And if that ground profited from the arrangement, well, that was simply smart business. The crystal spires of Atlantis pierced the amber sky like the teeth of some ancient leviathan, their surfaces refracting the light of twin suns across the pleasure world's pristine gardens. Here, in this sanctuary of marble and myth, the air itself seemed to crackle with unspoken threats and barely contained violence. Franklin's massive form cast long shadows across the intricate floor mosaics, each step of his tyrannomite boots echoing with purpose across the pavilion's open expanse. The gardens themselves were a masterwork of controlled beauty, savage thorns wrapped in velvet petals, crystalline fountains whose waters ran red in certain lights, and floating lotus flowers that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. Yet it was not the artistry that drew the eye, but rather the lethal tableau being performed by warriors of two realms. The Kabbalite warriors were phantoms among the exotic blooms, their void black armor absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Their weapons, elegant tools of death, remained holstered but carried an aura of readiness, like coiled serpents waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Their masks betrayed no emotion, yet their stances radiated a silent, lethal promise. In contrast, the Secret Service moved with disciplined precision, each of their towering forms marked by the proud heraldry of liberty. These were not merely space marines, they were Primaris, the Emperor's vision perfected. Their mech suits gleamed in defiance of the alien shadows, and every step was calculated, every position meticulously chosen to dominate the battlefield. Tactical supremacy was their unspoken language, a warning to any who might misjudge the restrained menace they exuded. At the center of this tense tableau, First Captain Denzel Washington approached the Clavakes with the deliberate grace of a master duelist. The twin blades at his side, the legendary Kusanagi no Tsurugi and Totsuka no Tsurugi, radiated latent power, their presence as commanding as the warrior who carried them. Denzel's every movement was precise, an unspoken declaration of absolute confidence as he closed the distance between himself and the incubi leader, until mere breath separated them. The Clavakes' hands hovered near his claves, weapons stained with the blood of countless foes. Yet something in Denzel's composure, the unshakable certainty in his stance, the poised lethality in his every motion stayed the alien warrior's hand. It was not fear that halted the Clavakes, but the razor-sharp realization that to draw his weapon would mean certain death. The tension between them was electric, a storm on the verge of breaking, each waiting for the other to flinch. Meanwhile, Captain Stephen Armstrong confronted Draken Nazire with unsubtle force. His massive frame, encased in armor humming with nanotechnological energy, radiated raw, primal power. The energy fields of his power fists crackled like caged storms, their menace impossible to ignore. Armstrong's voice cut through the charged silence, rough and defiant, "Give peace a chance, Xenos. Or don't. Either way, I'm good." The Draken's expression remained obscured behind his ornate helm, but the tension in his posture betrayed a careful calculus. His every movement was deliberate, a study in measured grace, yet even his prideful demeanor could not ignore the brutal reality of Armstrong's fists, tools capable of reducing even the finest Draken armor to smoldering debris. The pavilion's serenity seemed almost theatrical, a cruel irony against the charged menace that filled the space. Lotus flowers drifted idly across still pools, their languid motion contrasting sharply with the poised aggression of the warriors. Draped curtains swayed gently in a perfumed breeze, as if the very air conspired to heighten the tension, turning the moment into a scene from a dark fable. Lady Malice watched the unfolding tableau with eyes that had witnessed years of plotting and power. She observed Franklin Valorian's entrance a deliberate performance of casual dominance. The Primarch's every movement spoke volumes in the ancient language of power. His approach to the ornate chair was itself a statement, where lesser beings might have awkwardly managed the ill-fitting furniture, he simply reached out with ceramite-clad fingers and altered reality to his preferences. The chair grew to accommodate his transhuman frame, a casual display of power that spoke more eloquently than any verbal threat. He glanced at the drinks laid out before him, another layer of the game. They both knew that as host, she should be offering refreshment. Yet this was his territory, his sector. The unspoken question hung in the air, who truly plays host here? Their eyes met across the elaborately set table, and the real duel began. Malice, young yet already a master of the great game of Chimerac, found herself measuring this transhuman giant with new appreciation. Most Mundaki relied on brute force or clumsy attempts at cunning. But in Valorian's eyes she saw layers of calculation that she would have mistaken for a rival archon. The tension outside filtered through the pavilion's gossamer curtains like a persistent perfume. Malice found her attention drawn to the deadly tableau, even as she maintained her locked gaze with the Primarch. The positioning was exquisite in its menace, every angle covered, every possible movement accounted for. The first captain's invasion of the Clavex's personal space was particularly telling. Such a move required absolute confidence not just in one's own abilities, but in the complete coordination of every warrior on the field. Would I dare such a gambit? The thought rose unbidden in her mind. The answer came just as swiftly, no. Her warriors were deadly, skilled, and bound to her will through fear and ambition. But that hair-trigger responsiveness, that absolute trust between commander and commanded, such things were foreign to the Dark City's philosophy. The strategic implications unfolded in her mind like a deadly flower. The Space Marines had positioned themselves within killing range of her officers, yes, but they too were exposed. Yet behind them, at precisely calculated distances, the Liberty Guard waited with their rifles. One wrong move, one dropped blade or twitching trigger finger, and the entire garden would become a charnel house in a matter of heartbeats. The realization struck her with the force of revelation: this was not merely a show of force, but a demonstration of philosophy. Valorian's warriors moved with such precision, such confidence, because they knew their brothers would die for them and, more importantly, live for them. It was a kind of strength Chimerac could never replicate, bound as it was by the chains of eternal betrayal. When Valorian rose to leave, the movement carried the same deliberate grace as his entrance. He had not touched the drinks, had not spoken a word, yet had managed to seize complete control of the encounter. The message was clear: I can walk away from this. Can you? The curse of awareness settled over Malice like a shroud. She had choreographed this meeting, had spent weeks arranging every detail to her advantage. Yet with a few simple moves, he had turned her own staging against her. If she let him leave now, all that preparation would crumble to ash. Worse, she could bet that rumors would spread through the Dark City of how the young Lady Malice had been outmaneuvered by a Mundaki, brilliant or not. Lord Valorian, she found herself saying, the words torn from her throat by necessity, leaving so soon? Please sit, let us discuss the future. Valorian paused, turning back to face her. His expression remained affable, even kind, but she saw now the truth beneath the facade. This was no mere warrior king playing at politics. Every gesture, every glance, every moment of this encounter had been calculated with ruthless precision. His smirk, his silence, even his apparent readiness to walk away, all had been weapons wielded with the skill of a cunning politician. Of course, he said, his voice warm and inviting, as though they were old friends meeting over drinks rather than mortal rivals locked in a battle of wills. He resumed his seat unhurriedly, like the embodiment of magnanimity. Yet she knew better. This was not mercy but the predator's patience, the willingness to let the prey exhaust itself before striking. Malice felt the full weight of her position. In forcing her to speak first, he had claimed victory in this opening round. Yet even in defeat, she found herself analyzing her opponent with growing fascination. That noble bearing, the casual confidence, the disarming smirk, they were masterful camouflage for something far more lethal. Beneath the civilized veneer lay a mind as sharp as any archon's, as cunning as any homunculus. Every gesture, every step, every moment of silence had been weaponized with devastating precision. He had turned the very act of sitting in a chair into a power play, had transformed his warrior's discipline into a psychological weapon, and had forced her to reveal her hand while never showing his own. Chapter 136, Words and Actions. Franklin and Lady Malice sat across from one another, the tension in the room thick as the shadows cast by the dim light of the pavilion. Franklin had deliberately reduced his size to just under 9 feet tall, a gesture of practicality rather than submission. He was still an overwhelming presence, his broad frame dominating the space, his eyes fixed on hers with an unyielding intensity that made the air feel charged. The pavilion's atmosphere thickened as Lady Malice spoke his name, her voice a finely honed blade wrapped in velvet. Franklin. The word escaped her lips like a weapon unsheathed, slicing through the pretense of formality. It was a calculated gamble, her tone threading intimacy and audacity together in a way that only she could manage. The Primarch looked up from his seat, unhurried, his perpetual smirk curling slightly at the edges. There was no urgency in his movements, his brow arching ever so slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of the power play, no reaction beyond the deliberate arch of an eyebrow. His gaze, calm and piercing, met hers without hesitation. Aurelia, he replied, her name rolling off his tongue like a note in a well-rehearsed symphony. His tone was smooth, layered with just enough warmth to intrigue but edged with an unspoken challenge. Does my name linger on your tongue as sweetly as it lingers in your thoughts? Her composure wavered, just for an instant, a moment so fleeting that any lesser being might have missed it. But Franklin caught it. He always did. The slight narrowing of her eyes, the barest flicker of her lashes, was confirmation that his shot had struck its mark. Recovering swiftly, she leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table as her gaze swept over him, shameless in its appraisal. Sweet words for a man who claims to have no time for indulgences, she purred, her smile curving like a blade as her fingers traced idle patterns across the surface of the table. But tell me, Franklin, do your hands command as deftly as your tongue? Franklin's smirk didn't falter, if anything, it grew sharper, the kind of expression that sent shivers down the spines of both allies and enemies. He leaned back in his chair, his massive frame exuding an unshakable calm, his fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm on the armrest. A firm hand, Aurelia, is often the simplest path to control, he said, his tone rich with quiet amusement. But those who crave it often find themselves longing for something more refined. Wouldn't you agree? Her eyes glittered with mischief, her laughter soft and low, curling through the air like smoke. Rising from her seat, she moved with deliberate slowness, each step a careful display of poised allure. Refinement, she mused, her voice dripping with insinuation, is a quality I treasure deeply. But I've found that the most satisfying results often come from a delicate balance. Pressure, and release. Franklin's gaze tracked her, his smirk never wavering, the picture of serene control as she circled him like a storm gathering strength. Pressure and release. He echoed, his tone carrying just a hint of teasing mockery. Sounds like an exhausting exercise. But I suppose you've always enjoyed pushing boundaries, haven't you? She stopped just behind his chair, so close he could feel the faint stir of her breath against his skin. Her voice dropped to a low, seductive whisper, the kind that promised worlds and demanded souls in return. Pushing boundaries, Franklin, is where the real pleasure lies. The question is. She leaned in, her lips brushing the shell of his ear, her words a slow tease. Whether you have the stamina to keep up. His chuckle rumbled deep in his chest, low and dark, carrying an unspoken challenge. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at her without fully turning. Oh, I'm more than capable, Aurelia, he murmured, his tone thick with meaning, his smirk cutting like a knife. The real question is whether you'll last when the pace isn't yours to set. Her fingers toyed with a strand of her hair, a calculated gesture that drew his attention to her neck, her shoulder, the subtle curve of her collarbone. Careful, Franklin, she replied, her tone edged with danger and allure in equal measure. Some find that running too fast leads to mistakes. And some, Franklin countered smoothly, his voice laced with quiet authority, find themselves caught before they even realize they're running. He leaned forward slightly, the chair groaning under his weight, his smirk never faltering as his eyes met hers with the weight of a silent promise. But I suspect you already know that. The tension between them was electric, a precarious balance of power and intent, each testing the limits of the other. Malice's smile was a mask of flawless control, but there was a spark in her gaze, a hint of something wild, untamed, and thrillingly dangerous. Her smile widened, a predator's grin, yet beneath it was something else, admiration, perhaps, or recognition. Oh, I like you, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her posture eased, her back pressing into the intricate curves of her chair as she studied him. Yet, as her amusement lingered, so too did a realization. Speaking to Franklin Valorian, attempting to charm him, was like conversing with a mirror, a reflection that not only parried her every move but jabbed back with equal precision. Aurelia's smile sharpened as she decided to shift tactics. The air between them crackled with unspoken intent as she reached for a delicate crystal from the folds of her armor. She slid it across the table with a motion as smooth as silk, her eyes gleaming with purpose. A gesture of goodwill, she said, her voice smooth as honey yet layered with subtle steel. Information on certain rivals. Their movements, their next little escapades. As she spoke, she unfurled an ornate fan, a flourish of artistry and lethality, hiding the lower half of her face. Yet her piercing gaze remained locked onto his, a predator still testing the boundaries. Franklin, unflinching, reached for the crystal with the measured poise of someone who knew every motion was being watched. He examined it briefly, then looked back at her, his unyielding brown eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent the faintest flicker of irritation across her concealed features. He didn't blink. Malice, despite her boundless cunning, felt the faintest brush of frustration. The dark eagle was impervious to her charms, not disinterested, but immune in a way that spoke of unshakable self-mastery. She held his gaze for a moment longer before her fan snapped shut, the sound crisp and final, cutting the connection like a blade. The Primarch placed the crystal aside, its glow dimming under his touch. With a calculated gesture, he retrieved a data slate from within his ornate mech suit, sliding it across the table to her. "My turn," Franklin said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of finality. "You'll find the reasons for my actions against your former dark city within. Consider it my reply to your gesture." Malice arched an elegant brow as she retrieved the data slate, her fingers brushing its surface. She activated it, her eyes flicking over the contents, their glint sharpening as the pieces fell into place. The information was damning. Detailed accounts, evidence of Asdrubal Vex's machinations, his raids, his theft of high-value research vessels, his meddling with Valorian trade routes. It was a dossier of power and leverage, a weapon as much as a gift. Her lips curled into a dangerous smile, her fan resting lightly against her lap. "Vect," she murmured, almost to herself. Her eyes danced with possibilities, each more deliciously vindictive than the last. Franklin's smirk returned, faint but unmistakable. "I do not care for gifts with strings attached," he said, his tone even, as though addressing an equal while making it clear she wasn't. "Especially from a race that excels in deceit and treachery. Consider this from me to you, a clean slate. No strings. No traps. Just an understanding." Lady Malice's mind raced with the speed of dark matter through the void, each calculation spinning through layers of possibility as she reached for the goblet. The crystal caught the light like frozen tears, its contents promising swift death to lesser beings. Her thoughts crystallized into razor-sharp fragments. "He indulges my advances like a lord tolerating a performer's act." The realization carried no sting. She was too much a creature of the Dark City for such petty wounds. Instead, it sparked a cascade of deeper understanding. The Dark Eagle played their game of seduction and threat not out of interest or weakness, but from a position of such overwhelming strength that he could afford to be amused by it. In that moment, her tactical assessment of Franklin Valorian underwent a fundamental shift. She had approached him as she would any powerful male, with a blend of charm and lethal intent, each smile concealing a dagger's thrust. But the Primarch was no mere warlord to be seduced or assassinated. He was a force of nature wrapped in transhuman flesh, playing along with her schemes while holding enough power in reserve to shatter her world. The poison in the goblet suddenly seemed almost childish, like bringing a splinter to a sword fight. Yet she had to try. The Dark City's ways were written in her immortal blood. The attempt itself would prove her worth, demonstrate her commitment to the great game they all played. Whether he lived or died was almost secondary to the message it would send. "I am no one's puppet," her thoughts purred, even as she calculated escape routes and contingencies. "Not even yours, Lord of Liberty." The data slate's contents burned in her mind precious intelligence about Vex's movements, his schemes, his vulnerabilities. A treasure beyond measure in the twisted spires of Chimerac. That the Primarch would trade such information for mere understanding spoke volumes about his confidence, his resources, his sheer unassailable position. The poison would either work or it wouldn't. The alliance would either hold or shatter. In either case, she had achieved her true objectives, establishing herself as a player worthy of notice, securing intelligence that would elevate her position, and most precious of all, gaining a measure of the being called Franklin Valorian. If the Imperium's retribution came again, she had bold holes prepared, worlds within worlds where she could weather any storm. The Dark City had taught her well survival was an art form, and she was rapidly becoming its master. The soft clink of glass against glass shattered the delicate tension of the pavilion. Lady Malice raised her goblet, her smirk curling like a predator's snarl as she said, "To alliances, however fleeting they may be." Franklin's brow quirked, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. He lifted his own goblet, his smirk mirroring hers in a way that felt deliberate, a reflection of her game. "To alliances," he echoed, his deep voice resonating with mock sincerity. They drank. The wine was rich, dark, and lethal. A slow burn, creeping through Franklin's senses, telling him what he already knew: poison. It was potent enough to kill even a Primarch. His expression remained impassive, his eyes never leaving hers. Slowly, deliberately, he finished the glass, tilting it slightly in a silent taunt. Lady Malice's smirk widened as she drained her own, leaning back in her chair with the air of someone who had just scored a decisive point. Strong enough for a Primarch, she purred, her tone dripping with triumph. Franklin's smile was as cool as ever, his voice a low murmur. Let's find out. He could feel the poison begin to crawl beneath his skin, but the effect was slow, giving him time. Time to make his move. He was faster than she could blink. In an instant, he was on her, his large hands gripping her neck with enough force to assert his dominance, yet not enough to crush her. His lips crashed against hers with a ferocity that was anything but tender. The kiss was brutal, violent, almost punishing as he forced his tongue into her mouth, forcing hers apart as he returned the poison with a brutal intimacy that left no room for misinterpretation. Malice fought back instantly, biting down hard on his bottom lip, her teeth sinking into his flesh with the savage force of a predator. The taste of blood flooded her mouth, a thrill sparking in her chest at the violence of the exchange. But Franklin didn't pull back. No, he fought harder, pressing her further into the kiss, his blood dripping onto her tongue as he slammed her against the edge of the table. Her muffled snarl vibrated against his mouth as she fought back, her free hand darting for the dagger concealed in her armor. The blade shot toward his neck in a blur of motion, but Franklin's other hand intercepted it effortlessly. His grip closed around her wrist like a vice, stopping the blade mere millimeters from his skin. For the briefest moment, their eyes locked again, hers blazing with fury, his glowing faintly with a golden sheen that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. When he finally released her, it was with a shove that left her momentarily breathless. She staggered back, her lips tingling with the remnants of the poisoned kiss. Her hand darted to her side, retrieving a small vial from a hidden compartment. Without hesitation, she downed the antidote, her body trembling slightly as the counteragent worked its way through her veins. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the faint sound of her breathing. Malice's smirk returned, though it was weaker now, tinged with something she rarely showed: uncertainty. "You're full of surprises," she managed, her voice a touch raspier than before. "Though I admit, I didn't expect you to return my gift quite so intimately." Franklin leaned back in his chair, utterly unbothered, his gaze fixed on her with a predator's calm. "I don't care for surprises," he said evenly. "Especially ones that come in a glass." Her smirk widened, though her fingers still trembled faintly as she set the empty vial aside. "Perhaps I miscalculated," she admitted, her tone laced with dark humor. "It seems I underestimated just how resilient you are." Franklin's gaze remained steady, his lips curling back into that faint, maddening smirk. "A dangerous mistake, Aurelia," he said, deliberately using her name as if to assert his dominance. "One I suggest you avoid in the future. Because next time, you might not survive." Her laughter, though soft, filled the pavilion like the hiss of a serpent. "Duly noted," she said, her tone as sharp as her blade had been. "But tell me, Franklin, did you enjoy it?" His smirk deepened, his brown eyes boring into hers as he stood, his towering frame casting a shadow over her seated form. "Not nearly as much as you hated losing." And with that, he turned, leaving the pavilion with a deliberate, unhurried stride that exuded confidence. Behind him, Malice remained seated, her fingers brushing against her lips, the taste of him mingling with the remnants of the antidote. Tension lingered in the air, the aftermath of negotiations that had teetered dangerously close to violence before swerving into an uneasy accord. At the fore of the group, Denzel offered a lopsided grin to their silent Clavakes escort. His hand hovered near the ornate hilt of Kusanagano-Tsurugi, the subtle promise of violence laced with a veneer of humor. Behind him, Captain Stephen Armstrong brazenly turned his back on Draken Nazire, a calculated insult that practically dared the Dark Eldar to act. The heavy tyranimite of his armor caught the faint light of the setting sun, casting reflections as his broad shoulders shook with suppressed laughter. "Subtlety suits you, Armstrong," Franklin remarked dryly, his tone imbued with the faintest trace of amusement. The towering Primarch's movements were deliberate, with an aura of unassailable confidence. "Subtlety is overrated," Armstrong quipped, his grin widening. As they approached the waiting storm bird, its massive form a comforting sight of imperial engineering amid the alien architecture, Denzel finally gave in to his urge to comment on what he'd witnessed. He nudged his Primarch with an elbow, a gesture that would have seemed impossibly informal to other legions but was characteristic of the Liberty Eagle's unique command structure. "Frank," Denzel managed between barely suppressed snickers, "I believe you've just invented an entirely new school of diplomatic relations." Franklin rolled his eyes with the practiced ease of someone who had long since embraced his reputation for unorthodox methods. "Yes, Yes, he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone explaining something perfectly reasonable that just happened to sound completely insane. Kissing the Drukhari Archon did indeed have its tactical advantages. Tactical advantages, he says, Armstrong boomed from behind them, not even trying to keep his voice down. You slipped her the tongue while slipping her the poison right back. That's not tactics, that's just showing off. The Stormbird's ramp descended with a pneumatic hiss that seemed to punctuate Armstrong's statement. As they ascended, Franklin continued his defense with the air of a professor explaining a particularly complex theorem. The psychological warfare aspect alone was worth the risk. Besides, he added with a grin, who would expect a Primarch to return a poisoned kiss with interest? The scene that greeted them aboard the Sweet Liberty would have shocked any traditional Imperial observer to their core. Inside, the command crew had already prepared a hastily sketched banner reading, Diplomatic Innovator Extraordinaire. The Primi-born captains, the elite of the Liberty Eagles, had arranged themselves in what could only be described as a mock award ceremony. Director Samuel L. Jackson stood at their head, his typically stern face split by an uncharacteristic grin. Ladies and gentlemen, Jackson announced with all the gravity he could muster, which wasn't much given the circumstances, I give you the greatest innovator in Imperial diplomacy, the man who has revolutionized cross-species diplomacy, the one, the only, Franklin Valorian. The assembled officers broke into applause, with Denzel Washington now fully giving in to his laughter, doubled over and clutching his mech suit's midsection. Vladimir, the chief librarian, was practically howling with laughter, his psychic aura flickering with mirth and causing nearby data slates to display firework animations. Captain Henry Cavill, the time-displaced warrior, stood at the back of the group, his expression caught between amusement and disbelief. Having witnessed countless diplomatic encounters across his life, even he had to admit this was a first. I don't remember this particular negotiation technique in any of the historical records, he managed to say, which only served to increase the general hilarity. John Ezra, ever the professional head of the Secret Service, maintained his composure the longest. He offered a single, dignified nod of approval, though the slight upward curl of his lips betrayed his amusement. A most effective demonstration of close-quarters information exchange, my lord, he deadpanned, which finally broke his own composure as he joined the general laughter. Franklin Valorian, liberator of worlds, and now apparently innovator of cross-species diplomatic relations, stood before his celebrating sons with an exaggerated bow. He raised his hands in mock acceptance of their accolades, playing to his audience. My sons, he proclaimed with theatrical gravity, let it be known that the Liberty Eagles will always go above and beyond in the pursuit of successful negotiations. Though perhaps, he added with a thoughtful expression, we should keep this particular technique out of the official training manuals. Too late. Armstrong called out, holding up a data slate. I'm already drafting the chapter title, Advanced Negotiation Techniques, when words fail, try tongue. As the celebration continued, Franklin couldn't help but reflect on how uniquely blessed he was to command a legion that not only accepted but celebrated such unconventional methods. In any other legion, such behavior from a Primarch would have been met with shocked silence at best, or accusations of heresy at worst. But the Liberty Eagles were different. They understood that sometimes the most effective weapon in their arsenal was the unexpected, the unconventional, the absolutely ridiculous turned into tactical advantage. Director Jackson eventually called for order, though his attempt at seriousness was somewhat undermined by the occasional chuckle that escaped his usually stern demeanor. While we're celebrating our Primarch's innovative diplomatic skills, might I remind everyone that we still have an alliance to formalize. Though perhaps we should handle the paperwork wearing protective gloves, given the circumstances. And mouthwash, Denzel added helpfully. Definitely mouthwash. Franklin Valorian looked around at his commanding officers, his sons, his family, and felt a surge of pride. In a galaxy full of darkness and relentless war, they had managed to maintain their humanity, their sense of humor, and their ability to find joy even in the most absurd situations. It was, he reflected, perhaps their greatest strength, the ability to face the darkness not just with bolters and blades, but with laughter and light. Chapter 137, Celebrations. Franklin Valorian sat in his personal quarters aboard the Sweet Liberty, his massive frame dwarfing the ornate chair specifically crafted to accommodate his Primarch physique. Before him, suspended in midair by technologies beyond even his comprehension, floated what appeared to be a simple library card, though simple was hardly the word for an artifact granted by the laughing god himself. Beside it, displayed on a stand of wraithbone and adamantium, was the elaborate suit of a harlequin troop master. The mask of the suit winked at him. Franklin blinked, then squinted. He had checked the mask for sentience 3 times already, finding nothing but ancient Eldari runes programmed with specific behaviors. The wink happened again, and he could have sworn the mask's permanent grin grew just a fraction wider. "What do you make of this?" Franklin asked aloud, though not to any mortal ears. Within his mind, the presence of Cain stirred not the fractured, raging thing that existed in avatars across the galaxy, but a more complete consciousness, bound to him through the sword and Eris. Cain's voice resonated in his thoughts, carrying the heat of a forge and the sharp edge of a blade. "It is, as many things are with my brother, a matter of trust." There was a hint of exasperated fondness in the god's tone. "Segarac has always had his peculiarities in choosing allies." Franklin raised an eyebrow. "I'm sensing a story there." "Many stories," Cain replied, and Franklin could feel the god's amusement. "You must understand, among all the variations of you and your brothers he has observed across the skein of fate, you are his preferred Primarch." His words, not mine, were something along the lines of excellent comedic timing, and jokes that are literally deadly. Franklin grinned. "I'm flattered. I think." "Do not be too flattered," Cain warned, though there was humor in his voice. "The laughing god's gifts always serve multiple purposes. Yes, this suit will complement your ability to take the form of an Eldari, and paired with the mannerisms and speech patterns I taught you, like one from the ancient empire, which might be rather conspicuous. But knowing Segarac, he likely sees you as another piece on the great games board, one he can position against the chaos gods." "So I'm a pawn?" Franklin asked, reaching out to touch the mask. "No," Cain responded firmly. "You are more akin to what humans would call a wild card. Segarac believes, and I find myself agreeing, that your particular approach to warfare and leadership mirrors his own in certain ways. Where I would simply strike down an enemy." "You'd stab them," Franklin interjected. "I would stab them," Cain agreed, without shame. "But Segarac? He would orchestrate events so precisely that the enemy would end up stabbing themselves, and somehow find it poetically appropriate." Franklin leaned back, considering this. "You sound like you speak from experience." The god's presence shifted, and Franklin felt what could only be described as divine embarrassment. "There were incidents during the height of the Eldari Empire. Segarac and I, despite our drastically different natures, often found ourselves in each other's company. I was the Empire's god of war, yes, but warfare requires strategy as much as strength. And Segarac, well, he had his own ideas about military planning." "Do tell," Franklin prompted, thoroughly amused by the direction this conversation was taking. "There was one particular campaign against a race of silicon-based entities," Cain began, his tone suggesting the beginning of a long-suffered tale. "I had gathered the military leaders for a strategic briefing. Segarac appeared uninvited, I might add, and decided that the best way to explain his proposed battle plan was through interpretative dance." Franklin nearly choked. "He didn't." "He did. 3 hours of increasingly elaborate movements, each one supposedly representing different troop movements and tactical objectives. The worst part? It worked. His plan was brilliant, once you understood the metaphorical significance of his pirouettes." Franklin found himself laughing, the sound echoing through his quarters. "Please tell me there's more." "There was the time he replaced all my weapons with prop swords that turned into bouquets of crystal fire flowers when swung. Or when he convinced an entire webway portal to redirect into a theater he had prepared, just so he could force me to watch his latest performance art piece about the futility of uncontrolled anger. He called it the angry god gets anger management. And you put up with this because..." Cain's presence warmed slightly. "Because beneath all his foolishness and tricks, Segarac sees patterns that even I cannot. His methods may seem mad, but they have purpose. When he appeared to me before a great battle, juggling soul stones and telling ridiculous jokes, it was his way of showing me that I was taking myself too seriously, becoming too rigid in my thinking. A warrior who cannot adapt, who cannot see the absurdity in existence, becomes predictable. And predictable warriors die." Franklin looked again at the harlequin suit, understanding dawning. "So this gift is both a tool and a lesson," Cain confirmed. "The suit will allow you to walk paths usually closed to humans, yes. But more importantly, it is Segarac's way of saying that sometimes the best way to win a war is to make your enemy laugh right before you strike the killing blow." "And the winking mask?" "Knowing my brother, it probably contains the secrets of several major webway routes, a few devastating weapons, and at least one practical joke that will activate at the most inappropriate moment possible. He once hid the tactical plans for an entire crusade in a juggling ball, simply because he thought it was amusing to watch me try to catch it. Franklin stood, walking over to examine the suit more closely. You know, for someone who claims to find him annoying, you seem to have spent a lot of time with him. War and laughter, violence and joy, they are not as separate as many believe, Cain mused. Segeric understood this better than most. He knew that my path of bloodshed needed his path of revelry to remain balanced. Just as your legion's overwhelming firepower is balanced by your own sense of humor and humanity. So what you're saying is, I should definitely try on the suit. Cain's presence flickered with what might have been resignation. I am saying that Segeric chose you for a reason. He sees in you what he saw in me, the potential to understand that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from the strength of your sword arm, but from the strength of your performance. Plus, Franklin added, reaching for the mask, it'll really confuse the hell out of anyone who sees a Primarch doing Eldari dance moves. Just, promise me one thing, Cain requested. Name it. When you inevitably end up performing some ridiculous dance number in the middle of a crucial battle because Segeric has influenced you, make sure someone records it. I want proof that I'm not the only warrior he's managed to turn into an unwitting performer. The mask winked again, and Franklin could have sworn he heard distant laughter echoing through the warp, the sound of a god who had just successfully placed another piece on his cosmic game board, and was thoroughly enjoying the show. The celebration hall of the Sweet Liberty pulsed with life and laughter, the massive space filled with the sounds of revelry and joy. Franklin had spent the better part of an hour engaging in drinking contests with his sons, contests that, despite his enhanced physiology, still left him feeling pleasantly warm. The Libertin beer, specifically crafted to affect even transhuman biology, had done its work well. Now he found himself standing on one of the upper observation decks, overlooking what might have been the most audacious example of technological achievement in his flagship, an artificial beach, complete with its own captured star. The pale golden light of the miniaturized sun cast everything in a perfect sunset glow, its carefully controlled solar flares creating waves that his mortal auxiliaries surfed with practiced ease. The manifestation of Cain beside him was subtle, more of a shimmer in reality than the towering, bloody apparition most would expect from the Eldari god of war. The deity's voice carried equal parts amusement and bewilderment. Let me understand this correctly, Cain began, his form solidifying as he spoke. You took ancient Eldari technology capable of capturing and relocating stars through the webway. Yes, Franklin confirmed, taking another sip of his beer. You successfully reverse-engineered this technology, improving upon its efficiency. Correct. And your first thought was to use this monumentally powerful technology to create a beach inside your ship. Franklin's grin widened. The ultimate flex, wouldn't you say? Taking ancient technology and using it not for war or conquest, but to give my people a place to surf and sunbathe? It's like saying, look what we can do with your toys, while simultaneously throwing the galaxy's most elaborate beach party. To his surprise, Cain actually chuckled, a sound like distant thunder. I suppose there is a certain artistic irony to it. Though I must admit, watching your mortals surf those solar waves. The god's form shifted, and Franklin sensed an unexpected nostalgia emanating from him. It reminds me of the ancient Eldari. They would do the same, you know. Ride the solar tides between stars, turning even the most fundamental forces of the universe into sources of entertainment. Below them, a group of auxiliary troops had started a volleyball game, the ball occasionally passing through the carefully controlled gravitational fields that kept the miniature sun's power in check. Franklin watched them for a moment before asking, what brings you out of your usual contemplative state? Feeling festive? I was curious, Cain admitted. This gathering seems different from your usual celebrations. There's an energy, an anticipation that feels distinct. Ah, Franklin nodded, turning to face his divine companion. It's New Year's Eve. In about 3 hours, by Nova Liberta's time, we'll transition from 840.m30 to 841.m30. It's a tradition we brought from Old Terra, celebrating the end of one year and the beginning of another. Cain's form shifted again, this time radiating genuine confusion. You're celebrating a planet completing its orbit around a star. When you put it that way, it sounds a bit silly, Franklin laughed. But yes. Sweet Liberty's internal chronometry is synchronized with Nova Liberta's orbital period. We maintain that connection even when we're light years away. It helps maintain a sense of home, of continuity. Is this celebration practiced throughout the Imperium? Cain asked, watching as a particularly skilled surfer executed a complex maneuver through a solar flare. Franklin's expression sobered slightly. No, it's mainly a libertine thing now. The Imperium, well, during the long night, they lost most of their celebrations and holidays. The age of strife stripped away so much of humanity's cultural heritage. It's one of the things we're trying to preserve and restore. A celebration of the passage of time. Cain mused, his form flickering with what might have been amusement. Is this one of those concepts that only makes sense to short-lived species? Something my immortal perspective fails to grasp. Franklin burst out laughing, the sound carrying across the artificial beach below. Several partygoers looked up, raising their drinks in salute to their Primarch. Oh, that's rich coming from you. Are you seriously telling me that in 65 million years of ruling the galaxy, the Eldari never had celebrations? No festivals? No markers of time? Cain's form shimmered with what might have been embarrassment. We had our observations. Our cycles. The great festivals of... He paused, seeming to search for the right words. Perhaps I should rephrase my question. Why mark such a relatively arbitrary point in time? Why this particular revolution around your star? Franklin leaned against the railing, considering his answer. It's not about the astronomical event itself. It's about reflection and renewal. Humans need these moments of transition, these symbolic fresh starts. We look back at what we've accomplished, acknowledge our failures, and make promises about doing better in the cycle to come. It's hope, wrapped in the trappings of astronomy. Ah, Cain's form solidified further, taking on a more distinct shape. Now that, I understand better than you might think. The Eldari had similar practices, though on vastly different scales. We marked the transitions of ages, the great cycles of empire. Segeric would often insist on the most elaborate performances to mark these occasions. The god's tone carried a mixture of fondness and exasperation. Once, he orchestrated a play that lasted for 1,000 years, with the final act coinciding with the alignment of 3 galactic arms. Now that's commitment to a bit, Franklin chuckled. Though I have to ask, did anyone actually stay for the whole performance? The beauty of immortality, Cain replied dryly, is that you can take intermissions lasting several centuries and not miss much of the plot. Though Segeric did insist that anyone who left had to wear a special mask that would randomly spray them with crystal water when they returned. Below them, the party was reaching a new level of energy. Someone had started a conga line that wound its way along the beach, weaving between the carefully controlled gravity wells that kept the miniature sun's power in check. Astartes and mortals alike had joined in, their laughter echoing off the vast chamber's walls. Your people seem happy, Cain observed. At peace, despite being at war. That's part of what we're fighting for, Franklin replied. Not just survival, not just victory, but the right to have moments like these. To celebrate, to laugh, to mark the passing of time in our own way. The Emperor wants to unite humanity, and I support that goal. But unity doesn't have to mean uniformity. A wise distinction, Cain agreed. A countdown had started below, though they were still hours from midnight. Someone had apparently decided that somewhere on some world, it must be New Year's already, and that was reason enough to celebrate. Franklin watched as his sons and their mortal companions counted down from 10, raised their glasses, and cheered for a moment that wasn't quite here yet. Would you like to join them? Franklin asked, turning to his divine companion with a mischievous grin. I'm sure they'd love to see the Eldari god of war doing the conga. Cain's form flickered with what might have been horror. I think I'll maintain my dignity, thank you. Though. The god paused, his next words carrying a hint of amusement. If you're looking for divine participation in your revelry, I suggest waiting until you try on Segerica's gift. I have a feeling the laughing god would be far more amenable to joining a conga line. Now there's an idea, Franklin laughed. Imagine the headlines, Primarch and laughing god lead galaxy's longest conga line through webway. Please don't give him ideas, Cain groaned. He's insufferable enough as it is. Though. The god's form shifted once more, taking on a more contemplative aspect. Perhaps there is wisdom in your way of marking time. Even for immortals, perhaps especially for immortals, it's important to pause. To reflect. To remember that even in the midst of war and darkness, there can be moments of joy. That's what we're fighting for, Franklin agreed, raising his glass. Not just to survive, but to live. To celebrate. To surf solar waves and do the conga and mark arbitrary points in our planet's orbit with hope and joy. Below them, another countdown had started. This time, Franklin joined in, his voice carrying across the artificial beach. And if anyone noticed that the miniature sun's light seemed to pulse in time with the numbers, or that the solar waves created a pattern that looked suspiciously like a laughing face, well, that could be blamed on the Liberton beer. After all, even gods could use a good party now and then. The Continental High Command chamber aboard the Sweet Liberty fell into an unusual silence as Franklin Valorian strode in wearing the elaborate costume of a harlequin troop master. The outfit, a masterwork of Eldari artistry, shifted colors with each movement, creating patterns that seemed to tell stories of their own. But it was the mask that drew the most attention, particularly when it winked at Denzel, causing the first captain to nearly spill his recaf. "Brothers," Franklin addressed them, his voice carrying its usual warmth despite coming from behind the enigmatic mask. "I've called you here because I'm about to undertake a rather unique expedition." Stephen Armstrong, the second captain, cleared his throat. "Sir, with all due respect, is that mask supposed to be doing that?" He pointed as the mask performed what could only be described as an elaborate eyebrow waggle at him. "Oh, that's normal," Franklin waved dismissively. "It's actually quite restrained compared to what Segurika's artifacts usually do. You should see what happened when I tried to eat breakfast wearing it." John Ezra, head of the Secret Service, leaned forward. "My lord, are you certain about this course of action? Entering the Black Library, even with the Laughing God's blessing, it's unprecedented. That's what makes it fun." Franklin's grin was audible in his voice, even if hidden behind the mask. "Besides, we need the information stored there. The library card Segurik gave me is legitimate, probably the first ever issued to a human, which I'm thinking of putting on my resume." Samuel L. Jackson, director of the CIA, raised an eyebrow. "And you're sure this isn't some elaborate prank by the Laughing God?" The mask winked at him. "Oh, it's definitely also a prank," Franklin admitted cheerfully. "But that's just Segurika's way. He never does anything for just one reason. It's probably simultaneously a test, a joke, a deeply meaningful metaphor, and a way to annoy Cain." As if on cue, the presence of the war god manifested briefly, just enough to convey a feeling of divine eye-rolling. "Your instructions while I'm gone are simple," Franklin continued, straightening to his full height. "Maintain course to the nearest webway gate. Keep the party supplies stocked. You know how our auxiliaries get when they run out of those little cocktail umbrellas. And try not to worry too much about the occasional killer clown that might pop by to check on things." "Killer clowns, sir?" Vladimir Mendeleev, the chief librarian, asked with concern. "Harlequins," Franklin clarified. "They'll probably stop by to make sure we're not misusing their boss's gifts. Just try to appreciate their jokes, even the deadly ones. Especially the deadly ones, actually they put a lot of effort into those." Behind Franklin, reality began to shimmer as a webway portal materialized. The patterns on his costume seemed to respond, flowing like liquid light across the fabric. "Sir," Denzel spoke up, "should we prepare any particular protocols for your return?" "Just the usual," Franklin replied, already moving toward the portal. "If I come back speaking entirely in riddles and dancing instead of walking, that's probably normal. If I come back with a sudden appreciation for paradox-based humor, also normal. If I come back with a collection of books that try to read you instead of the other way around, well, that's just basic Black Library etiquette." He paused at the threshold of the portal, turning back to face his commanders. The mask's expression had shifted to something more serious, though it still couldn't resist throwing in a final wink. "In all seriousness, brothers, I trust each of you with my life and the lives of our legion. The Black Library holds knowledge we need, what Magnus needs to cure his legion's flesh change, and Segurik has offered us a chance few humans will ever receive. Keep our people safe, keep them happy, and remember, if anyone asks where I am, tell them I'm doing research at the library. It's technically not even a lie." With a final salute that somehow managed to be both perfectly regulation and slightly theatrical, Franklin stepped through the portal. As it closed behind him, the assembled commanders exchanged glances. "So, Armstrong finally broke the silence, who's going to explain to the crew why their Primarch just left dressed as a space elf court jester?" "Leave that to me," Jackson sighed. "I'll file it under routine diplomatic outreach in the official reports. Though I do have one question: did anyone else's coffee cup just wink at them, or should I be concerned?" The laughter that followed was only slightly nervous, as somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a divine chuckle echoed through the halls of the Sweet Liberty. Chapter 138, the Black Library. The darkness of the webway enveloped Franklin Valorian as he stepped through the portal, his boots echoing against crystalline floors that seemed to whisper ancient jokes. The transition from real space to the labyrinthine passages was always disorienting, but what happened next would make that seem perfectly normal by comparison. A face materialized from the shadows painted white with dramatic swirls of color, topped with a magnificent hat festooned with bells that somehow managed to jingle silently. The face split into a grin that seemed to exist in more dimensions than strictly necessary. "Welcome to the Book Nook, Prime Jester." Segara's voice boomed with the authority of someone announcing the galaxy's greatest comedy show. "Sweet Mother of Liberty!" Franklin yelped, his voice breaking just enough to ruin his usual aura of unshakable cool. His hand instinctively flew to the last word, and before his brain could catch up, the mighty Primarch unleashed a dazzling symphony of pure, unadulterated panic shooting. Bang! 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 "Freedom bullets for everyone!" he bellowed, spinning wildly like a malfunctioning turret. Somewhere, a bald eagle probably shed a tear of patriotic pride. Segara slipped through the hail of bullets like a shadow in the moonlight, effortlessly avoiding each shot. Every movement was an artful display, a graceful sidestep, a fluid cartwheel, and even a moment where he paused mid-motion to straighten his collar, as if bullets were no more troubling than a passing breeze. "Your marksmanship is as American as apple pie served with a side of more apple pie," Segara declared, somehow ending up in a rocking chair that definitely wasn't there a moment ago. In his hands was a comically oversized book titled How to Jest, Primarch Edition. Franklin finally lowered his weapon, recognition dawning on his face. Oh! Oh! It's you! The Laughing God! Segara. Segara rocked back and forth, the chair making absolutely no sound despite its apparent creakiness. "But before we proceed with today's installment of Webway Warriors, the Reading Rainbow Edition, I must ask." He leaned forward dramatically, bells tinkling in reverse. "Do you have your library card?" On cue, a thunderous applause erupted from everywhere and nowhere, complete with phantom whistles and what sounded suspiciously like a laugh track from M2 sitcoms. Franklin, catching on to the game, reached into his armor with theatrical flourish and produced the crystalline card Segara had given him after their joint webway breach-sealing adventure. "Why yes, my most jovial of jesters. One Black Arius Library Arius card, certified for all your forbidden knowledge needs." Segara produced a stamp from his sleeve, a stamp that looked suspiciously like a rubber chicken, and brought it down on the card with all the gravity of an imperial declaration. "Stamped and approved by the Department of Whimsy and Forbidden Knowledge." "Say," Franklin asked, brushing off some sparkly stamp residue, "why do you call me Prime Jester? Is it because of my incredibly witty battlefield banter? My dashing good looks? My ability to make even Dorn crack a smile? Actually, that last one might be impossible." Segara's grin somehow managed to grow even wider, defying several laws of facial geometry. "Why did the Prime Jester cross the webway?" he asked instead, his voice carrying the weight of ancient cosmic humor. Franklin, matching Segara's tone perfectly, replied, "To get to the other side of knowledge. Because normal roads are too mainstream, and teleporters lack dramatic flair." "Correct." Segara leapt up, the rocking chair vanishing as if it had never existed. Another round of phantom applause filled the space, this time with the distinct sound of harlequins crying encore. Encore! The Laughing God gestured to an ornate door that materialized in the darkness, its surface covered in shifting runes that occasionally arranged themselves into knock-knock jokes. "The Black Library awaits, Prime Jester. Within its halls lie the secrets you seek, the cure for your red-skinned brothers' sons, and the knowledge to prevent Magnus from doing everything wrong." "Everything wrong?" Franklin chuckled, stepping toward the door. Like that time he tried to send a psychic message to Terra and ended up redecorating the Imperial Webway in chaos chic. "Precisely." Segara cackled, the sound echoing through dimensions that hadn't been invented yet. Though I must say, his interior decorating skills were rather mind-blowing. As Franklin crossed the threshold into the Black Library, he could have sworn he heard Segara humming what sounded suspiciously like the Reading Rainbow theme song, but with lyrics about forbidden knowledge and cosmic jokes. The Laughing God's final words followed him in, "Remember, Prime Jester, the best jokes are the ones that save the galaxy. And always return your books on time, or face the dreaded late fees of destiny." The door sealed behind Franklin, leaving him in the vast expanse of the Black Library. Somewhere in the distance, a book about paradoxes fell off its shelf, but only after someone would pick it up later. "Well, Franklin muttered to himself, straightening his armor, time to hit the books. Let's see if we can't find something to help Magnus avoid his everything wrong phase. Maybe there's a self-help section, so you've accidentally doomed the galaxy, a primer on prevention. The library seemed to chuckle in response, and Franklin could have sworn he saw a book titled exactly that float by on a nearby shelf. Just another day in the life of the Primarch of Liberty, where even the pursuit of knowledge came with a healthy side of cosmic comedy. The black library stretched before Franklin in a way that could only be described as impossible. Bookshelves floated in absurdly unnatural geometries, some twirling around like cosmic merry-go-rounds, others twisted into Mobius strips of infinite knowledge. It was as though a demented librarian had decided to take the Dewey Decimal System out for a spin, fed it some quantum physics, and left it to do its thing in a reality where physics had forgotten the rules. Well, Franklin muttered under his breath, scratching his chin as he surveyed the chaos, I've seen some weird stuff in my time, but this is an all-you-can-eat buffet of madness. At the front desk, a harlequin librarian sat motionless like a mannequin, staring ahead with an unsettling, gleaming smile. Before Franklin could even say hello, the harlequin produced a white cardboard sign that fluttered into view with an elegance that made Franklin briefly wonder if he was hallucinating. Don't look at me. I'm just a librarian. Franklin blinked. His jaw hung open for a moment before he snapped it shut. I'm looking for... Whoosh, a new card materialized in front of him. Books? Books of power? Books of spells? Aha! Books to prevent a brother from doing something stupid. Yes, exactly. Franklin replied, genuinely impressed. How did you? Flash, another card appeared, blocking his sentence entirely. SHHH, no talking. Franklin blinked. He could almost feel his IQ dropping by the second. The Primarch of Liberty, a man who had once faced entire armies and won, was now reduced to an awkward mime act. His eyes darted around until he spotted a whiteboard with a marker beside it. Grabbing both with the enthusiasm of a man finding a treasure chest in the desert, he quickly scribbled a simple, yes. The harlequin librarian's shoulders trembled with that laughter, before they flashed another impossibly long card before him. It unfurled like a scroll of doom, or perhaps a magical shopping list. Shelf 12432983298398398234412, aisle number 102938349284298990800976. Fuck, Franklin eloquently summarized the situation. With an entirely too long pause, the librarian waved him away with an air of silent amusement. A silent, eternal amusement. As Franklin trudged away, feeling a little more foolish with every step, a second harlequin appeared. This one wore a vest covered in question marks that seemed to rearrange themselves every time Franklin glanced at them. They had a card in hand. Need help finding shelves? Franklin, desperate, nodded so vigorously that his troop master outfit had begun to manifest 1,000 different colors simultaneously. Flip new card. We have a specific face mask just for this occasion. Where? Franklin immediately regretted breaking the no-talking rule, but the question had slipped out before he could stop himself. The harlequin nonchalantly pointed to a chair that, no joke, definitely hadn't been there a moment ago. It looked suspiciously comfortable, like it had been sitting there for centuries waiting for him. Franklin, realizing that the Dignity ship had long since sailed, flopped into it with a groan that echoed across the void. Franklin took off his blinking mask. What followed was, undoubtedly, the strangest makeover session in Imperial history. The harlequin worked with the precision of an artist and the speed of a caffeinated squirrel. Franklin sat still, bewildered and somewhat alarmed, wondering if this was what normal people experienced during armor fittings. After what felt like an eternity, the harlequin presented him with a mirror. The Primarch of Liberty stared at his reflection in stunned silence. His face had been transformed into an absurd clownish masterpiece. White makeup as a base, swirls of blue, red, and white accenting his features, at least they matched his legion's colors, dramatic eyebrows that seemed to defy the laws of gravity, and the piece de resistance a brilliant, bulbous, and impossibly red nose that could probably be seen from space. Damn it, Franklin muttered in disbelief. As he reached up to touch the nose, he noticed something that made him groan. It was glowing. Glowing. The red sphere pulsed and flickered, and when Franklin turned in certain directions, it seemed to light up the hallway in an almost directional way. A compass, he muttered to himself, blinking. A cosmic comedy compass. The harlequin had already vanished, leaving Franklin to contemplate his newfound absurdity alone. He sighed deeply, adjusting his glowing red beacon of idiocy as he glanced over the bookshelves, which now seemed to rearrange themselves in response to his newly acquired guide. The nose glowed brighter when he faced certain directions, dimmed when he went the wrong way. Occasionally, it honked loudly, which surprisingly seemed to send nearby harlequins into fits of silent, shuddering laughter. Franklin wasn't sure if he was offended or just tired of being this ridiculous. "This is going in my memoir," Franklin declared to absolutely no one in particular. Chapter title: Red Nose, Red Magnus, A Tale of Two Directories. And so, Franklin wandered deeper into the infinite labyrinth of knowledge, guided by his constantly illuminating nose. Every book seemed to have a name so convoluted that even the letters seemed to get confused. One shelf was labeled in an infinite string of pi digits that only contained the ones that had appeared in knock-knock jokes. Another shelf constantly changed its number every time Franklin blinked. He blinked, the shelf was different. He blinked again, and it was the same as it had been 5 seconds ago. A harlequin librarian floated by on a ladder that was somehow sideways. They held up a thumbs up before flashing a card that read, "The Nose Knows." Franklin stopped, narrowing his eyes as he looked down at his ridiculous red beacon. He thought for a moment, his mind reaching a profound conclusion that felt like the cosmos had just clicked into place. Maybe, he mused, this is why Magnus had so many problems. He tried to categorize everything logically. You can't navigate the impossible with possible thinking. You have to embrace the absurd. The nose gleamed brighter. It was almost like it was applauding his newfound philosophy. As Franklin continued down the endless halls, with gravity shifting every third step and bookshelves rearranging themselves to mock him, he couldn't help but feel a little bit of admiration for the sheer genius of it all. In a place where reality itself bent and twisted, where knowledge so vast it could drive a normal person mad was hidden, what better way to secure it than by forcing someone to abandon their entire understanding of how things were supposed to work? Note to self, Franklin mumbled, as his nose began to lead him toward a shelf marked with symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. Suggest Clown College for Liberty Eagles officer training. Might improve their ability to think outside the box, or inside the box that's actually outside another box that only exists on Thursdays. Franklin's glowing red nose led him through the impossible geometry of the black library, occasionally honking when he made wrong turns. As he navigated the labyrinthine shelves, his attention was caught by a rather peculiar collection of books that seemed to be actively trying to get his attention. The first volume that caught his eye was bound in what appeared to be leather, though he desperately hoped it wasn't what it looked like. In gaudy golden letters, the title proclaimed, "The Chaos God's Favorite Recipes." "Well, this should be interesting," Franklin muttered, carefully opening the tome. The table of contents read like a fever dream of a cooking show gone horribly wrong. Slonish's sensual souffle, warning, may cause inappropriate feelings toward baked goods. Kern's Bloody Mary Special, now with real blood. Supply your own skulls. Siencha's ever-changing casserole, recipe changes while you cook it. Nurgle's Garden Fresh Soup, definition of fresh may vary. "I'm pretty sure this violates several imperial health codes," Franklin commented, hastily closing the book when he noticed the pages were slightly moist. Next to the cookbook sat a bright yellow volume with cartoonish illustrations that practically screamed user-friendly. Its title, A Beginner's Guide to Warp Energy for Dummies, was accompanied by a subtitle, Because Everyone Makes Mistakes, Looking at You, Magnus. Just as Franklin reached for it, a holographic librarian materialized looking suspiciously like an ancient Windows assistant. "Did you mean, defeating chaos?" the flickering figure asked helpfully. "No, I was actually looking for. Have you tried turning the warp off and on again? That's not how the warp. Error 404, reality not found. Please contact your local chaos god for assistance." Franklin pinched the bridge of his nose, careful not to disturb his glowing navigation apparatus, and sighed. "I'm starting to regret diving into this." A slim volume caught his eye, What Really Happened to the Squats. As his hand approached it, the book literally burst into flames, leaving behind a small note that read, "Nice try. The management." "Well, that's just rude," Franklin muttered, brushing ash off his armor. Finding another reception desk, or perhaps it was the same one that had moved, Franklin approached with his most winning smile, which probably looked ridiculous given his current facial decoration. "I'm looking for information about how to cure flesh change," he began. The harlequin librarian flashed a card, "For advanced knowledge, ask again in 1,000 years." But I'm a Primarch. New note, fine. 999 years. Among the shifting shelves, a particular book seemed to call out to him, forbidden knowledge that should not be read. The cover even had a little sign saying definitely don't open this, especially if you're a curious Primarch with a red nose. Well, now I have to, Franklin declared, opening the book. The pages immediately began assaulting his dignity. Your hairline is receding faster than the Imperium's borders. Nice nose, did Segeric pick that out for you? You call those tactical decisions? I've seen orcs with better strategy. Your legion's color scheme looks like it was chosen by a colorblind Slaaneshi cultist. Finally reaching the last page, Franklin found the promised ultimate forbidden knowledge, a collection of ancient Terran memes adapted for the 41st millennium. The first showed a small yellow rodent with his lasgun, captioned, "When you face the Tyranids but your lasgun runs out of flashlight batteries." The next pages contained an increasingly anxiety-inducing sequence about a planetary governor's worst day ever, complete with animated pics showing the gradual descent into absolute chaos, Kriegsmen arriving en masse, Inquisitors showing up uninvited, the Imperial Fists enacting the Last Wall Protocol, the Custodes leaving Terra, never a good sign, Primarches returning, Orcs offering alliance, the Silent King dropping by with his entire race, and finally the Astronomicon going dark. I should probably warn that guy, Franklin mused, before remembering this was probably just a joke. Probably. As he continued his exploration, Franklin encountered the infamous shifting bookshelf. Each time he blinked, the contents completely changed. His first grab yielded The Complete History of the Eldar, by Ulthwese Historian, a surprisingly thin volume containing only one chapter, We Don't Talk About the Fall. The books began changing faster and faster, until suddenly one caught his eye, A Study of Franklin Valorian's Smile, a photographic history. Well, I'll be damned, Franklin chuckled, flipping through the pages. The photographer really got all my good sides. Though I question the chapter titled Smirking Through Successful Logistics Operations, that seems oddly specific. As Franklin continued his journey through the stacks, he couldn't help but notice the increasingly self-aware nature of the library's contents. One shelf contained nothing but books, while another seemed to be dedicated entirely to theoretical works about theoretical works. A small note attached to a nearby shelf read, "Warning, the contents of this shelf may contain recursive humor. Side effects may include existential crises, temporal paradoxes, and the uncontrollable urge to make dad jokes." Now they tell me, Franklin muttered, already feeling the urge to make a pun about library cataloging systems. Franklin's glowing nose cast a gentle crimson light on the dusty shelves of the black library as he was drawn to a plain, brown tome nestled between a grimoire pulsating with ominous energy and a book whispering forbidden truths in binary. This one, however, was conspicuously unremarkable. Its title, faintly embossed and smudged with time, read, The Book of Unflinching Logic, by someone who's had enough of this nonsense. Well, this promises to be interesting, Franklin murmured, picking it up. The book exuded an aura of resigned practicality, as though its sole purpose was to exist as the most reasonable object in an otherwise insane universe. He opened the cover and was greeted by a table of contents that didn't bother with riddles or mysticism. The brutally honest chapter titles made him pause. Being an 8-feet-tall demigod is cool, but it's awkward in spaceships. Space elves are cool, but nobody buys the merchandise. The real problem with genetically engineered super soldiers, they can't communicate. Tyranids, the galaxy's most unemployed ecosystem. Franklin flipped to the first chapter, chuckling as the text wasted no time cutting through pretension. Sure, you're a towering figure of might and majesty, but try squeezing into a cockpit designed for beings with more reasonable proportions. Hope you enjoy hunching, because that's your life now. And don't even get us started on armor weight. Congratulations, you're a walking tank that can't fit through most doorways. He sighed, nodding as if the book had reached into his soul. Finally, someone gets it, he muttered, recalling the countless times he'd left Primarch-sized dents in supposedly reinforced walls. I should send a copy of this to Armstrong. Turning the page, he found the next chapter on space elves. Their aesthetic is unparalleled, their lore is deep and mystifying, but James' Workshop says their merchandise sales are underwhelming. Result? Plot irrelevance. They're like that cool band no one listens to because the lead singer uses too many metaphors. James' Workshop. Franklin mused, raising an eyebrow. The name sparked a faint memory from Old Terra, though what it referred to exactly eluded him. Probably some ancient profiteer who knew his audience. The chapter on genetically engineered super soldiers hit a little too close to home. They're perfect warriors, disciplined and loyal. But let's face it, their dialogue skills are limited to yelling in battle or ominously quoting their rulebook. It's like trying to bond with a brick wall that occasionally chants for the Emperor. He winced but couldn't help laughing. I'm going to need to implement some communication workshops in the Liberty Eagles. Further along, the book tackled the Tyranids with a level of irreverence that made him laugh out loud. What's the endgame here? You eat everything in the galaxy. Great. Now what? Open a restaurant? Evolve taste buds? Maybe the real galactic apex predator is existential boredom. Scattered footnotes seemed to argue with each other, their tone veering between sardonic and bizarrely insightful. One read. The universe's absurdity is its own defense mechanism. Don't question it too hard unless you want to implode. Its counterpoint immediately followed. Implosion might be the most logical reaction to all of this nonsense. Franklin's grin widened as he stumbled upon a margin note scribbled in jagged handwriting. If you're reading this, congratulations. You've found the only sane text in an insane galaxy. Or have you? Definitely not Seguruk. He groaned. Of course. Who else could be behind this? He glanced around, half expecting a harlequin to pop out and applaud. The final chapter left him with a statement that lingered in his mind long after he read it. You know, Franklin said to no one in particular, maybe the real logic was the absurdity we found along the way. His nose honked softly in what felt like agreement. Closing the book, Franklin carefully returned it to its place, resisting the urge to open it again when the title momentarily shifted to, How to Outwit a Primarch, Volume 1. He stared at it for a moment before shaking his head. Not today, he muttered. As Franklin continued deeper into the black library, his red nose glowed faintly brighter, casting light on his smirk. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of laughter echoed, but whether it was from the library or his own mind, he couldn't be sure. Chapter 139, The Cure? Franklin's glowing red nose pulsed urgently as he passed another impossible bookshelf. This one appeared to be constructed entirely out of rejected manuscripts bound together with hope and coffee stains. He was about to move on when a particularly outrageous book cover caught his superhuman eye. By the Emperor's perfectly maintained manicure. Franklin muttered, reaching for the book. The cover featured what could only be described as the most over-the-top space marine illustration he'd ever seen. The warrior was impossibly muscular, even by Astartes standards, straddling a motorcycle that appeared to be made of pure lightning and screaming souls, while somehow managing to dual-wield chain swords in the warp. Behind him, what looked suspiciously like an explosion in the shape of an eagle was giving a thumbs up. What in the Emperor's name is a Warhammer? I know it's a weapon. Franklin muttered, picking up the book cautiously, half expecting it to burst into flames or summon a daemon. Flipping the cover open, he found the first chapter, Making Your Character Relatable. Step 1, Make them an invincible gigachad, Franklin read aloud. He blinked, looking down at his own towering, perfectly sculpted physique. Well, that's oddly specific, every Primarch is. Step 2, Give them a hot goth girlfriend, he continued, pausing as a particular dark Eldar archon came to mind. That's just asking for trouble. The steps continued, and Franklin couldn't help but chuckle as he read, Step 3, There is no Step 3, you've already won. He closed the book shut then and there, but a niggling curiosity kept him going. The text alternated between absurdity and startling insight. Remember, you can bend the lore, but never break it. The setting is awesome. James' workshop just doesn't know what to do with it half the time. Franklin's smirk faded. James' workshop? That name keeps coming back, and why do they sound like an imperial functionary who's somehow both incompetent and brilliant? Chapter 2 delved into more specifics, developing side characters and subplots. Step 1, Make them quirky but not too quirky. The meme potential must remain high. Franklin recalled his Prim-born captains quirky? They're professionals. Mostly. Step 2, Give them wildly impractical but cool weapons, the book added. At this, Franklin laughed outright. His legion's arsenal included everything and then some. I think we might be guilty as charged. Chapter 3 raised his hackles a bit, How to handle lore. Step 1, Stick to the canon but don't be afraid to interpret it differently, you can bend the lore, but never break it. The setting is awesome. James' workshop just doesn't always know what to do with it. Step 2, Absolutely no female space marines. James' workshop was slick with the custodes thing, but bad writing made them fall off. If you want badass women, use Sisters of Battle, Inquisitors, or Dark Eldar. They're way cooler anyway. Franklin paused at the passage, furrowing his brow. Female Space Marines. He muttered aloud, shutting the book for a moment. He began pacing, his mind firing on all cylinders. No, that wouldn't work genetically, it's not viable, he mused, scratching his chin. The genocide was designed specifically for the male biological structure. It interacts with the hormonal balance, skeletal density, and musculature that males have evolved for combat efficiency. Using females would be, well, biologically inefficient. He frowned deeper, crossing his arms. It's not a matter of exclusion or bias, this is bioengineering 101. Even the custodians, who are crafted through bioalchemy, remain male for the same reason. Their transformation process reshapes every cell, every fiber of their being, and it's fine-tuned for peak performance in a male body. If dear old dad ever attempted a female custodian, she wouldn't just be functional, she'd probably end up resembling some kind of Terran goddess, a literal embodiment of perfection. But that's not the point, it's a matter of practicality, not aesthetics. Franklin shrugged off the notion. This isn't about ideology or fairness, it's about optimization. Both Space Marines and custodians are war constructs, not egalitarian experiments. He waved the thought away with a dismissive hand. Still, something about the whole argument nagged at him. Why would anyone think this was a good idea? Inefficiency in either case wouldn't just be a design flaw, it'd be a betrayal of the Emperor's intent. No wonder the notion never made it past the drawing board. It's nonsense and utterly stupid, he muttered. Let's see what other absurdities this thing has to offer, Franklin said, cracking a smirk as he resumed reading. When he reopened it, the next chapter caught him off guard. Chapter 4, Never Abandon Your FIC. Step 1, Under no circumstances should you let your FIC rot in the warp. Take a long hiatus, and when you return, pretend it was all part of your grand, multi-year narrative arc. If your fans start rioting, drop an out-of-context teaser chapter that solves nothing but reignites speculation. Step 2, Dump all your half-baked ideas onto an abominable intelligence and watch it self-delete. If even the Men of Iron can't make sense of your plot threads, you're probably onto something great. Franklin couldn't help but laugh out loud. So, you either go missing for decades or overload an AI. Sounds about right for this galaxy. Chapter 5, Engaging the Fandom Without Losing Your Sanity. Rule 1, Never ask for constructive criticism. The fandom will either worship your FIC like it's the Lectitio Divinitatis or flame you harder than an exterminatus. There's no middle ground. Rule 2, Always reply with lore-bending answers. If someone questions your choices, say, it's based on pre-M28 archival fragments, which are notoriously unreliable. Works every time. Rule 3, Tease spin-offs you'll never write. Drop hints about a secret lost chapter or a collaboration with Segurica's Harlequins. Fans will lose their minds while you sit back and laugh. The book also included scrawled advice from past readers. For every chapter you write, sacrifice a bag of Doritos to the Omnissiah. It helps. At one point, a section titled What Not to Do was crossed out entirely and replaced with There are no rules. Just don't make the Tyranids talk. That's cursed. Franklin sat back, stunned. The final chapter concluded with closing thoughts. Warhammer is a labor of love and madness. Your job as a writer is not to make sense of it but to make it entertaining. Remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there's always room for a laugh. Just don't let James' workshop find out. Franklin closed the book, exhaling deeply. So this Warhammer. It's a universe where everything is ridiculous and grim, but somehow, it works. He looked at his surroundings, the towering, endless shelves of the Black Library, the whispered secrets of the Eldari. Why does this feel so familiar, like someone has been watching my life and writing it down? Franklin's luminous nose led him through another impossible turn in the Black Library, honking with increasing urgency until it practically strobed like a disco ball. He came to an abrupt halt in front of a section that made his enhanced transhuman brain do a double take. Robot Exivrain section. Franklin read aloud, his voice a mixture of disbelief and morbid curiosity. What in the name of sweet liberty is this? The shelves before him were adorned with hearts made of wraithbone and ultramarines insignia twisted into romantic symbols. The books themselves seemed to pulse with an embarrassing energy, their titles written in flowing script that somehow managed to be both Gothic and Eldari at the same time. A Tale of Blue and Gold, When Logistics Meet Love. Franklin picked up one tome, his face a picture of growing horror. The Avenging Sun's Eternal Flame? 500 Worlds of Love. By the Emperor's perfectly maintained ABS, what is this? He flipped open one of the books, immediately regretting his decision. Robot's heart skipped a beat as Ivrain's graceful form materialized from the webway portal. Your organizational skills are most impressive, she whispered, examining his latest spreadsheet. Nope. Franklin slammed the book shut. That's enough of that. Though I have to admit, that's exactly how Robot would flirt. Nothing gets him going like a well-organized logistics report. His attention was drawn to a wall of fan art. Some pieces were respectfully done portraits showing Guilliman and this mysterious Ivrain in noble poses. Others, well, Franklin wished he could unsee certain interpretations of how power armor might interface with Eldari spirit-linked garments. Sweet mercy, Franklin muttered, there's even a holodrama series? The theoretical and the practical, a love story? Who is writing these? Who has time for this? We're fighting a galaxy-spanning war, and someone's sitting around writing romantic fanfiction about my brother. He picked up another book, this one titled Administrative Guidelines to the Heart. Chapter 1, The Codex Amorous. Okay, that's actually pretty funny. While the Codex Astartes does not support this action, the Heart has its own protocols. By Liberty's light, this is simultaneously the worst and best thing I've ever read. Franklin's tactical mind couldn't help but analyze the situation. So, Ivrain. Emissary of Ennead, the Eldari god of death. Interesting parallel there, she's got her death god, I've got my war god. Though obviously, I'm way cooler. Cain at least knows how to party. Death gods tend to be a bit of a downer at social events. He chuckled, imagining the family dynamics. Oh man, the family gatherings must be interesting. Robot probably tries to establish proper seating arrangements while she's teaching him Eldari meditation techniques. Actually, that might explain a lot about future Robot's stress management. A nearby harlequin materialized, holding up a card, shipping section popular with both humans and Eldari. Bestseller in Kymarak. Even the Dark Eldar are reading this. Franklin shook his head in amazement. I guess romance really is universal. Though I'm slightly concerned about what they consider romantic. He noticed a small note attached to one of the shelves. All proceeds go to funding joint human-Eldari cooperation initiatives and spreadsheet optimization research. Of course, Franklin snorted. Leave it to Robot to monetize his own romance for the good of infrastructure development. That's my brother, even his love life has to be efficiently managed and properly budgeted. The harlequin flashed another card, want to see the fanfiction section about you. There's a what now? Franklin's voice cracked in a most un-Primarch-like manner. The harlequin's shoulders shook with silent laughter as they vanished, leaving Franklin with the horrifying knowledge that somewhere in this library, there might be shipping stories about him too. Note to self, he muttered, never tell Robot about this. He'd probably try to regulate the fanfiction industry and create a standardized template for romantic narratives. Although, that might actually improve some of these writing styles. Franklin's glowing nose led him to a section that could only be described as aggressively green. The shelves were crude, seemingly bolted together with random pieces of metal, and covered in crude glyphs that somehow managed to look both philosophical and violent at the same time. A sign, written in what appeared to be red paint, or possibly blood, proclaimed, Finken real hard about Krumpen, da ork philosophische shun. Oh, this should be good, Franklin chuckled, ran his fingers over the first volume in front of him. The spine was adorned with a crude engraving that read, compiled by various weird boys who fought good and thought better. His laughter bubbled up uncontrollably as he flipped the cover open. De real Waik. Ain't air, it's over dear, in de big green place in de sky where Gork and Mork live. Franklin read aloud, his voice shifting to match the exaggerated Orcish accent. He couldn't help but smile at the attempt to parallel Plato's cave allegory. If Plato only knew, The next page illustrated crude drawings of orcs stuck in dark caves, staring at shadows on the walls. Arrows and labels provided commentary like, Dis git finken he sees de real fight end but de real fight is behind im, Yazog. He laughed out loud. Magnus would either stroke out or write a dissertation on this. Franklin rubbed his eyes, his mind swirling with the hilarity of it all. Gork and Mork as orcish gods of enlightenment, what a concept. The next book was bound with jagged metal plates, stamped with the title, Beyond Good and Evil, 'cause both is good for fightin'. Gork and Mork? Nat, zog dat. We're the real gods, boys. Franklin read, his grin stretching wider. It's like they've reinvented orc existentialism. In the Wadaik. We kill the Wadaik. To bring life to the real Wadaik. It was a bizarre, but surprisingly deep perspective. Orcs weren't just existing, they were fighting to exist, to impose their will on the galaxy with violence. There was no need for the moral struggles of good versus evil. As Neatsork wrote, the only thing that mattered was fighting. Flipping through the next book, Franklin read the title with a grin, Descartes' Philosophical Revelations, Cogito Ergo Wadaik. I think, which means I think I wanna punch ye, Franklin quoted, unable to hold back his laughter. Cogito Ergo Wadaik. This is the essence of orc existentialism. To think, you must punch, and to punch is to truly exist. The book illustrated orcs punching things with scientific precision. Fact, if you can punch it, it's real, and, of course, if you can't punch it, ya ain't trying hard enough. Franklin snorted. Magnus would be ecstatic about this. Or horrified. Either way, he'd want to write an entire treatise on it. Turning the page, Franklin reached for the next book. He squinted at the title, laughing to himself, Orkstotel's Golden Daka, Philosophy of Balanced Violence. De best Wadaik. As lots of choppin' and lots of shootin'. If you can't do both, you're doing it wrong. Franklin read aloud, now sitting cross-legged, absorbed in the book. This is tactical gold. A proper Wadaik needs balance. Balance of Daka and Choppa. The book included detailed diagrams that showed the correct ratio of shooting to chopping. Daka plus Choppa equals propa fight and more Daka times more Choppa equals best Wadaik. Franklin scratched his chin thoughtfully. This belongs in the Liberty Eagles training manual. It's surprisingly sound advice. The next title caught his eye, Socrates' Methodology, If an Orc Stompa explodes, does it still count as a crumpin? If an Orc Stompa explodes, but no gets as dear to see it, does it still count as a crumpin? Franklin was practically howling with laughter now. The philosophical implications are staggering. This is like quantum mechanics meets orcish warfare. The book included transcripts of Socrates' famous debates, which mostly consisted of him asking questions and then headbutting anyone who gave answers he didn't like. I love this, Franklin exclaimed. It's like philosophy, only with more smashing. Franklin picked up a hefty tome, its cover emblazoned with an image of an orc smashing a Wadaik. Horn with a massive choppa. Inside, the writings were a strange blend of orcish fervor and pseudo-Hegelian logic. De Wadaik is like a punch-in fist, it moves through time, and every fight is a step into process of punchin' harder, Franklin read aloud, struggling to stifle his laughter. I mean, the idea that every fight leads to a greater conflict, that's kind of profound, right? He thumbed through the pages, finding lines like, every orc needs to fight himself before he can fight anyone else, and if the Wadaik ain't been fought, then the Wadaik ain't been born. I never thought I'd see the day Hegel's dialectic gets weaponized into a Wadaik. Primer, Franklin mused, but this is surprisingly deep. It's basically about eternal conflict. But with more explosions. The next book he discovered was a surprisingly serene-looking text, titled The Deo of Daka and Choppa. Franklin initially thought it was a joke, but once he opened the pages, he was mesmerized by the wisdom it contained. The best orc fights are the ones where you know when to chop, and when to shoot. Daka and Choppa, the balance of the Wadaik. Franklin chuckled, reading the first page, then stared at the rest in awe. The book described the orc approach to balance, likening it to the harmonious duality of Daka and Choppa. Too much Daka, and your enemy will scatter before you get a proper fight. Too much Choppa, and you won't have enough Daka to finish the job. The text went on to recommend, when the fight gets dirty, shoot 'em up, but when the fight gets personal, bring out the Choppa. Franklin's illuminated nose led him into the chaos section of the Black Library, a vast chamber divided into distinct color-coded areas that would make any interior decorator question their life choices. The purple section seemed to pulse with excess, the sickly green area appeared to be cultivating its own ecosystem, the red corner was literally bleeding knowledge, and the blue section, well, the blue section was doing something different every time Franklin looked at it. Right, Franklin muttered, adjusting his glowing nose. Time to visit the Bird Brains book collection. The Tsianch section whispered as he entered, thousands of books murmuring secrets, theories, and what sounded suspiciously like cosmic knock-knock jokes. A harlequin librarian was calmly dusting the shelves, seemingly unperturbed by the occult cacophony around them. Franklin watched in amusement as a particularly rebellious tome attempted to make a break for freedom, only to be smacked back into place by the librarian's feather duster with the precision of a marksman. "Ha! Nice shot," Franklin chuckled, earning a silent bow from the librarian, who then returned to their duties as if swatting escape artist books was just another Tuesday at the office. Following his increasingly excitable nose compass, which was now honking in what he swore was Morse code, Franklin ventured deeper into the labyrinth of Tsianchan knowledge. The books here seemed particularly animated, their spines rippling like waves as he passed. Some tried to catch his attention by fluttering their pages seductively, while others slammed themselves shut when he looked their way, playing hard to get. Finally, his nose blazed like a miniature sun, pointing him toward a particularly ornate tome. Its cover bore golden symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them, forming patterns that made his eyes water and his brain itch. "The Book of Curses and Arcane Knowledge," Franklin read aloud, lifting the heavy volume. "Well, that's surprisingly straightforward for Tsianch. Which probably means it's a trap." The moment he opened the book, it began whispering in what could only be described as a cosmic customer service voice, professionally condescending with a hint of ancient malice. The curse of the Thousand Suns was never truly a curse, but rather a blessing unintended, of course, by those meddlesome mortals. But how did they know what they were unleashing? Franklin's eye twitched slightly. Great, a book that talks like a corporate motivational speaker crossed with a fortune cookie. Undeterred, he continued flipping through pages dense with arcane lore, failed experiments, and what appeared to be Tsianchan grocery lists. Each page seemed to delight in being as vague and unhelpful as possible, like an ancient text version of a tech support chatbot. Finally, he reached the last page, his hopes high for some actual answers. Instead, he found: "The real cure to the flesh change is the friends we made along the way." Franklin stared at the page, his expression shifting through the 5 stages of grief in record time. He held the page up to the light, turned it upside down, and even checked for invisible ink. "You've got to be shitting me," he growled, his voice echoing through the library. Somewhere, a harlequin held up a quiet please sign, then quickly ducked behind a shelf as Franklin's glare could have melted ceramite. The book, perhaps sensing its reader's mounting frustration, began to shudder. A new page materialized, glowing with eldritch energy. "CK. Turn this page." Franklin slammed the book down on a nearby table hard enough to make several nearby volumes jump in their shelves. His hand began glowing with barely contained power, flames dancing between his fingers. "Listen here, you literary prankster," he addressed the book directly, "if the next page says anything about the journey being the destination or believing in yourself, I'm going to demonstrate why they call me the Liberator by liberating your pages from their binding." The book's pages fluttered nervously, like a butterfly realizing it had just taunted a flamer. The flames around Franklin's hand cast dramatic shadows across the pages, making the runes dance in terror. In what appeared to be a last-ditch effort at self-preservation, the book shuddered one final time and revealed its true message. "You're opening the wrong book, mortal. The answer to your query lies in the minor warp gods and their interactions when brought into the matrium. Seek them, for they may have the answers that Tsianch, in his infinite subtlety, has hidden from you, the one to my left." Franklin's gaze slowly shifted to the left, where an unassuming volume sat innocently on the shelf, its spine marked with symbols that seemed to wink at him. "You know," Franklin addressed the first book, extinguishing his flames, "you could have just said that from the beginning." The book's pages ruffled in what might have been a shrug, if books could shrug. "Of course not," Franklin answered himself, "because that would be too straightforward, and we can't have that in the Tsianch section, can we?" A nearby harlequin silently applauded his deduction, holding up a sign that read, "Now you're getting it." As Franklin reached for the indicated book, he couldn't help but wonder if Magnus had gone through similar trials in his quest for knowledge. Maybe that's why everything went wrong. Not enough patience for Tsianchan literary criticism. Chapter 140, Libraries and Gold. The protective ward surrounding the book shimmered like heat waves over desert sand, though instead of heat, it radiated pure knowledge. Franklin could feel the psychic resonance buzzing against his armor, making his newly acquired clown nose tingle with arcane energy. "Well," Franklin mused, reaching toward the barrier, "let's hope this goes better than Magnus' average Tuesday of forbidden knowledge-seeking." The ward responded to his touch with a gentle pulse, as if recognizing something familiar in his psychic signature. Instead of the expected resistance, it seemed to welcome him, parting like curtains before a VIP guest. The book practically leaped into his hands, its pages already fluttering open to the first chapter. "Eager little thing, aren't you?" Franklin chuckled. On the nature of nascent deities and their influence. The academic tone of the text was a stark contrast to the previous book's trolling, making the revelation all the more impactful. Finally, something written by someone who doesn't think coherence is a sign of weakness. "So that's how my soul was made, hey?" Franklin chuckled, his laughter echoing through the impossibly vast shelves. A nearby harlequin, who had been arranging books while standing on the ceiling, paused to hold up a sign, "Spoiler alert." Franklin leaned back against a bookshelf, which obligingly adjusted its angle to provide perfect support, and began processing the information, his tactician's mind connecting dots across millennia of history. "Let me get this straight," he mused aloud, earning a SHHH. From 3 different directions. He switched to a theatrical whisper, "The Emperor didn't just create my soul from scratch, he essentially created the conditions for a minor warp god of liberty to form and then anchored it into a Primarch-grade body." A book titled Obvious Answers to Obvious Questions fell off a nearby shelf, landing open at his feet. Franklin picked it up, finding a single word on the page, "Day." "Well, that explains a few things," Franklin continued, ignoring the literary sass. "The independence of Nova Libertas, the unwavering devotion to freedom, the ability to resist chaos corruption." He paused, looking down at his clown makeup in the reflection of a particularly shiny book cover. "Though it doesn't explain why I keep ending up in these ridiculous situations." A passing harlequin held up a quick series of cards. "Chaos gods equals drama. Minor gods equals comedy. U equals comic relief for the galaxy." "Thanks for the clarification," Franklin deadpanned. "Really helps with the existential crisis." He turned back to the book, his finger tracing over the section about localized reality manipulation and destiny convergence. The text seemed to glow slightly under his touch, as if responding to his presence. "So every time I've led my legion to victory, every impossible shot that landed exactly where it needed to, every plan that came together despite astronomical odds." He shook his head, grinning. "I've been basically running on divine probability manipulation powered by humanity's desire for freedom." The book's pages ruffled in what might have been agreement, or possibly just the cosmic equivalent of a shrug. "And the whole destiny convergence thing explains why Nova Libertas became such a powerhouse of innovation and independence." Franklin stroked his chin thoughtfully, smudging some of his clown makeup. "Though I have to wonder, did the Emperor know exactly what he was creating, or did he just throw some freedom-flavored warp juice into the Primarch soup and hope for the best?" A new book suddenly appeared on a nearby pedestal, titled The Emperor's Cookbook, Primarch Edition. Before Franklin could reach for it, a harlequin swooped down and slapped his hand with a ruler, holding up a sign that read, "That's for a different existential crisis." Franklin raised his hands in surrender, leaving the cookbook for another day. He returned to the text about minor warp gods, particularly focusing on the warnings about anchoring such entities. "Well, at least that explains why I can't sit still during council meetings. Try containing the anthropomorphic personification of liberty in a chair for 6 hours." He paused, considering. "Though I suppose it could be worse. Imagine if I'd been created from the concept of paperwork. Poor robot." The nearby books trembled in what might have been laughter. "But wait," Franklin said, a new thought occurring to him. "If I'm essentially an anchored minor warp god of liberty, and I'm trying to prevent Magnus from doing everything wrong." He trailed off, his eyes widening. "Oh, this is going to be interesting. A minor god of liberty trying to save a brother from becoming a pawn of Psianch. The irony levels are off the charts." A book titled Cosmic Irony, A User's Guide helpfully fell into his hands, opening to a chapter about family interventions across the immaterium. "Right," Franklin nodded, closing both books with determination. "So to save Magnus and his sons, I need to understand how his nature as a minor warp god might interact with their situation. Maybe find a way to use this whole harmonic resonance thing to counter the flesh change." He looked down at his still glowing clown nose, then back at the books around him. "Though first, I should probably figure out how to navigate out of here without looking like I just graduated from the Seguric School of Cosmetic Arts." The nearby harlequin librarian shook their head and held up a final card, "The nose stays on until the lesson is learned." "And what lesson would that be?" Franklin asked, already dreading the answer. The harlequin's response card read, "That sometimes the best way to fight chaos is to embrace absurdity." Franklin closed the weighty tome on minor warp gods with the careful precision of someone who's seen too many books try to bite back. The cover patterns writhed beneath his fingers like angry snakes at a jazz concert. All this talk about anchors and resonance, he muttered to his glowing clown nose, which honked sympathetically, and not one straightforward solution. Typical. It's like reading an IKEA manual written by Tsinch. Thud. The sound behind him was as subtle as a titan doing tippy toes. Franklin turned, his clown makeup somehow managing to express both resignation and curiosity, to find a new book sprawled on the floor. It lay there like a cat that had meant to fall and was now trying to play it cool. Warp Corruption and Remedies, a practical guide for the chronically screwed, Franklin read aloud, his painted eyebrows rising high enough to threaten escape velocity. Well, that's refreshingly blunt for the Black Library. Usually, they prefer titles like On the Nature of Nature's Natural Nature, Naturally. The book hummed in his hands like an excited puppy, practically vibrating with eagerness to be opened. A nearby harlequin librarian held up a sign, "IT likes you." "Great," Franklin muttered, "now I'm getting dating advice from library books." Nevertheless, he opened it, bracing himself for another round of cosmic trolling. Instead, he was greeted by text that could have come from a self-help book written by a particularly sassy author. Chapter 1, So, You've Got a Flesh Change Problem. Franklin's laughter echoed through the impossible architecture of the library, causing several books about silence to fall off their shelves in protest. Finally, someone in this maze of knowledge actually gets to the point. Though I'm pretty sure this is the first time in history anyone's treated widespread genetic corruption like it's a common cold. The next page revealed what could only be described as a children's book illustration of a space marine mid-transformation. The marine had googly eyes that seemed to follow Franklin as he moved, and the mutations looked more like balloon animals gone wrong than eldritch horrors. "This could be you." Franklin read the caption, snorting. "But don't panic, we've got solutions." "Right. If this book starts trying to sell me essential oils for the flesh change, I'm using it as target practice." The book's pages ruffled indignantly, flipping themselves with the attitude of an offended professor. They settled on a section titled Warp Stabilization Through Nascent Entities, Turning Chaos Against Chaos. "Now we're talking," Franklin leaned in, his clown nose casting a red glow over the text. "Though I have to admit, turning chaos against chaos sounds like fighting fire with fire, except the fire is sentient and has a grudge against reality." The chapter laid out its theory with all the confidence of a drunk remembering quantum physics. Harmonic resonance, sympathetic constructs, and warp stabilization techniques were explained with helpful diagrams that seemed to be drawn by someone who'd taken abstract art as a literal challenge. "So let me get this straight," Franklin mused, absently smudging his clown makeup as he rubbed his chin. "I need to find a nascent warp entity to act as a cosmic tuning fork for Magnus' sons? That's like trying to fix a broken violin with a demolition ball. Technically possible, but the collateral damage might be interesting." A harlequin materialized nearby, holding up a series of cards in quick succession. "Sounds dangerous. Could go horribly wrong. Do it anyway. For science." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Franklin deadpanned. "Really helps with the decision-making process." He continued reading, occasionally muttering commentary that would have made a tech priest blush. The book's warnings about over-reliance on nascent entities were particularly colorful, complete with little doodles of what appeared to be stick figures being consumed by their own success. Then came the postscript, written in font so small it might have been trying to hide from itself, "P.S. For best results, consult your local warp god before proceeding. Terms and conditions apply. Side effects may include spontaneous reality bending, time loops, or general eldritch weirdness. Refunds unavailable. Consult a warp god." Franklin laughed, closing the book with a snap. "Yeah, I think I'll pass on asking Tsinch for advice. That's like asking a cat for swimming lessons. Technically possible, but you know they're just waiting to watch you drown." He tucked the book under his arm, his tactical mind already plotting how to use this information with Magnus. "Though I suppose I could consult the Emperor. He's totally not a god, just a being of immense power who can reshape reality and may or may not be responsible for creating several demigods. Completely different thing." As Franklin turned to leave, his library card caught his attention, glowing with newly added titles. Minor warp gods and their interactions when brought into the Matrium. Warp Corruption and Remedies, a practical guide for the chronically screwed. "I don't even want to know what the late fees are like here," Franklin muttered, eyeing the card suspiciously. Probably something like Your Firstborn Soul or Eternal Service in the comedy section. The card hummed ominously, as if to say it had much more creative ideas for dealing with overdue books. Franklin could have sworn he saw fine print appearing and disappearing along its edges, listing penalties that would make a Damon Prince think twice. Library rules, he smirked, pocketing the card. Always more complicated than they look. It's like they took normal bureaucracy and decided to add extra dimensions to it. Literally. As Franklin strode deeper into the labyrinth of knowledge, his clown nose lighting the way, he couldn't help but wonder if this was all part of some cosmic joke. Here he was, a minor warp god of liberty disguised as a Primarch, wearing clown makeup, carrying books about fixing genetic corruption, all while trying to prevent his brother from doing everything wrong. A final sign floated down from above, "That's comedy for you." "Story of my life," Franklin replied, ducking under a shelf that had decided to rearrange itself into a Mobius strip. "Now, let's go see if we can't turn this tragedy into a comedy with a happy ending. Though knowing my luck, the happy ending will probably involve more clown makeup." His nose honked in agreement, and somewhere in the infinite library, the laughter of gods echoed through the impossible shelves, accompanying a Primarch on his quest to save his brother through the power of cosmic comedy and questionable library books. Franklin was making his way back to the exit, arms loaded with precious tomes, when his attention was caught by a golden figure slumped over a massive book. The custodian's armor gleamed in the library's shifting, unearthly light. Despite the battle plate, the figure had somehow managed to find the one reading chair in existence perfectly sized for his massive frame. "Kitten." Franklin's tone was laced with surprise. The custodian looked up from his reading. The book in his hands was entitled, "The Complete History of Everything, Abridged, Volume 1 of Lord Franklin." Kitten's expression shifted from surprise to mild concern. "What happened to your face?" Franklin's red clown nose let out an untimely honk, as if mocking him. "Not one word." Franklin raised a power-armored finger, his clown makeup somehow making the gesture both more and less threatening. "Not a single word about this to dear old Dad. Unless, of course, you want your armor to mysteriously turn silver overnight." Kitten's helmet snapped up straight. "You wouldn't dare. Try me, sunshine. I know a guy who knows several harlequins who'd consider it a delightful prank. My lips are sealed, Lord Primarch. Though I must say, the colors really bring out your eyes. Says the guy whose closest comrades are 3 oil-obsessed exhibitionists," Franklin quipped, settling into an impossibly convenient chair that materialized behind him. Kitten groaned, rubbing his temple. "Please, don't remind me. They've been at it all week. Do you know what it's like trying to train with constant posing and dramatic speeches in the background?" Franklin chuckled. "Let me guess that's why there's so much oil in the requisition forms. They call it essential materiel. I've tried explaining that we're not at war with dryness, but they don't listen," Kitten replied, exasperated. Franklin gestured at the surrounding shelves. "So, what brings you to this infinite nexus of impossible knowledge? Hiding from the fabulous 3? "Not exactly. Research," Kitten replied, patting his book. "There's so much here about the universe's history. Did you know there was a phenomenon in M2 called memes? Fascinating stuff. Though, I suspect some of these entries might be Segura's sense of humor. For example, I refuse to believe in the Great Crusade of the Dancing Lobsters." Franklin snorted. "If Segura wrote it, it's probably canon somewhere." Speaking of impossible things, Franklin leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "How exactly did you get in here?" "I had to seal breaches in the webway and make the laughing god himself laugh." Kitten set his book aside, sighing. "You know the webway portal beneath the palace? There's this tiny portal in the wraithbone structure barely visible unless you're doing a deep clean. Long story short, my custodian reflexes kicked in. Slipped through at the exact right moment." Franklin raised an eyebrow. "And ended up here. After a few wrong turns, yes," Kitten admitted. "The first time, I thought I was in trouble. But the harlequins seemed amused. They let me stay, probably because I reshelved the books properly." Franklin nodded sagely. "So, how often do you sneak in here?" Kitten hesitated before producing a crystalline library card, similar to Franklin's but embossed with tiny golden helmets. "Often enough to have one of these." Franklin stifled a laugh. "And what exactly are you borrowing?" Kitten looked away, suspiciously nonchalant. "Research. General knowledge." Nothing specific. Sure, Franklin drawled, smirking. Not at all related to the ginger cat I saw napping in the palace last week. Kitten coughed. Unrelated. Entirely. Franklin decided to let the topic slide, standing and adjusting his stack of books. Well, I should get going. Got a brother to save, a universe to fix, all the usual Primarch business. If you're taking the main exit, Kitten warned, watch out for the juggling section. The books there tend to participate. Franklin laughed, tapping his red nose. Thanks for the tip. And remember our deal. What deal? Kitten replied, already back to his reading. I've seen no Primarches today. Especially not one wearing excellent clown makeup. As Franklin strode toward the exit, he could swear he heard Kitten humming circus music. But then again, in the Black Library, absurdity was the rule, not the exception. With his mission accomplished and an unexpected encounter behind him, Franklin smirked. Knowledge gained, books secured, and plenty of blackmail material about a certain custodian's reading habits. All in all, a productive day in the grim darkness of the far future where, on occasion, even a certain custodian could find solace in a hidden library of infinite possibilities.
Thanks for listening.